Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Just to clarify that report that Boris Johnson has thanked America as well as our EU allies for their support and solidarity regarding this Russian threat. It's the State Department that's issued a harsh condemnation of Russia, not the White House. Donald Trump's Twitter account oddly empty, pretty much, when it comes to any reflection of what we used to laughingly refer to as the special relationship. Nothing special about our relationship with Russia this morning. I felt that Theresa May's speech in the House of Commons yesterday was her finest hour. The problem with doing this for a living is that you kind of have to form your opinions on the hoof, and sometimes you lose the leisure with which to frame them and even perhaps change them. So a week from now I may have to apologise to you with my tail between my proverbial legs and say that Theresa May was clearly blowing smoke up our collective fundaments, but she seemed strong, and yes, she also seemed stable, finally. Problem is what happens next when you turn that page, you know? That notion of they have until midnight tonight to respond. Well, what would a response be? I mean, this is really interesting. You know what's trending, don't you, on Twitter? Deadline for Moscow. It's like a Len Deighton or a Frederick Forsyth novel. You could see Pierce Brosnan playing the lead, couldn't you? Or a few years ago, I'm showing my age. It would be James Norton these days or someone like that. Deadline for Moscow. But this isn't funny. I mean, there are three people in a very serious condition in hospital still. History suggests that this sort of attack with this sort of agent is usually fatal. We know that up to 14 people now, according to a very detailed report by BuzzFeed, but not necessarily an infallible report, up to 14 people are subjects of suspicious deaths with links to Russia. I think the Home Secretary Amber Rudd is reopening inquiries into 4 of those deaths. And in the House of Commons yesterday, our Prime Minister Theresa May essentially stood up to Vladimir Putin. Now, there's a lot to talk about today, and it's all very well doing this for a living, but I don't know any more about what's going to happen next or what's happening behind the scenes than you do. Nobody does, actually. It's one of those very odd situations where we really are on tenterhooks, waiting to see what the response from the Kremlin is. It will be self-serving and corrupt, of that we can be certain, but whether or not it is effective is a different question entirely. So I don't know what we can do. I know more than most about the Magnitsky Act and the sanctions that have now moved front and centre. And if you've been listening to this programme for the last 3 or 4 years, you know a hell of a lot more about that issue than the average British citizen or journalist. Something of which I'm actually rather proud, even in these grisly circumstances. No one who listens to this programme on a regular basis will be surprised or confused by any of the talk of oligarchs, kleptocracies and sanctions, or indeed the legacy of Sergei Magnitsky. But those wheels move slowly, and they don't necessarily prevent the Russian regime from acting in this alleged way. They simply prevent supporters and friends of the Russian regime from spending and or laundering their ill-gotten gains in the markets of London. We have become something of a honeypot, unfortunately, for the dirtiest money on the planet, particularly in the context of Vladimir Putin. So there's so much to talk about, because you listened to the speech live yesterday, Theresa May's speech, and little light bulbs pop up in your head, little warning bells, when she said he's got 2 choices, or rather there are only 2 explanations. Either this was state-sanctioned, or the agent has somehow been nicked from Russia and transported to Salisbury. And I was wrong, I think, but there was a little bit of me there that wondered if she was giving him some sort of get-out clause. I think if we've learnt anything from the last 2 years, from the fact that we have a gangster in the White House and ourselves have a country embarked upon a course of epic national self-harm, and both of which have occurred under the guise of Western liberal democracies, we know that everything is slightly backwards at the moment. Everything is mad. Everything is up for grabs. So I've sort of found, you know, that little voice in your head that rules out the crazy stuff. Mine's very quiet at the moment. largely because every time I think something that could be construed as crazy, the little voice sort of says, yeah, but Donald Trump, though, anything crazy could happen. So when Theresa May was talking yesterday, I had two thoughts in my head, okay? The first was that the Home Secretary, when the investigation into Alexander Litvinenko's murder by Russian agents in this country was completed, who decided not to investigate further because of what she described as international relations, that was Theresa May. So the last time something like this happened in Britain, I think David Miliband was Home Secretary, was he? Well, anyway, Labour were in charge. But by the time the investigation was complete, it was on Theresa May's desk as Home Secretary, and she elected not to escalate. She elected not to investigate further. Problem is with that, and here's where things go a little bit conspiracy theory. The problem with that is that she wasn't in charge. She was ostensibly in charge of the Home Office, but she wasn't in charge of the government. The people in charge of the government were David Cameron and George Osborne. George Osborne now, of course, editor of the Evening Standard, owned by a chap called Eugenie Lebedev. So I don't know that Theresa May's reluctance, perhaps, to upset wealthy Russians, or whatever you want to call it, would be down to her or to her previous Prime Minister. Do you see what I mean? I don't know that my own first thoughts and impulses were fair to her. So I'm sort of thinking, well, why did she do this? She's covering her own back, and she's now giving Vladimir Putin a get-out clause. I don't think she is. I cannot construe circumstances in which Vladimir Putin will come out before midnight tonight and explain in detail how this incredibly sophisticated nerve agent that could only have come from one corner of this entire planet did somehow get stolen or misplaced or lost or ended up in Salisbury as a result of a perfectly plausible and logical chain of events which had absolutely nothing to do with Vladimir Putin or indeed his government. So I just don't buy that. I think it's pretty clear now that this happened, and the confusion over why we're making a bigger fuss about this than we did over Alexander Litvinenko probably does have something to do with the shifting tectonic plates of international relations. Russia in, was it 2006 or 7 when Alexander Litvinenko was murdered, but Russia then was not the threat to world peace that it is today. It was not seeking to sow instability across the West in order to distract attention from Putin's own thefts and kleptocratic behaviour. The rules have changed. Also, of course, the fact that Donald Trump, I know that sometimes on this programme we feel like a lonely island in a sea of misinformation and lies when we point out that a self-confessed sex offender with multiple bankruptcies and a fat streak of white supremacism is currently sitting in the White House. But you have to come up with a better theory for why he wouldn't speak out about his closest NATO ally being apparently targeted. The belief of Donald Trump's closest NATO ally is that the Russian government have attempted to murder someone on our soil. There are no circumstances in which an American president would fail to condemn that or offer support unless he was weighing up the two choices, Britain and Russia, unless he actually couldn't publicly explain that his ties to Putin were perhaps deeper and tighter than his ties to Theresa May. That's Occam's razor. That's the only possible explanation for why he hasn't followed Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in issuing a harsh condemnation of Russia. If he does so in the course of the programme today on Twitter, I shall tell you straight away. So where are we? America won't support us necessarily until the Russia investigation is complete and concluded and possibly there's a different president in place. The European Union, Guy Verhofstadt, very early on this morning spoke powerfully of solidarity and support, but we have, of course, voted to leave the European Union, and that happens in March of next year. That happens pretty much tomorrow, really, in broad terms. That massively compromises our ability to impose sanctions on Russia. That's the thing that Putin hates the most. So what can we actually do? If he doesn't come back today with a fully compelling and convincing account of how this could have happened, where has Theresa May left herself? What options has she left herself? What would retaliation against Russia look like? I also, in the context of yesterday's speech, will mention Jeremy Corbyn. I'm going to start prefacing in the hope that the very UKIP-flavoured nature of social media vitriol spat out by Jeremy Corbyn's supporters, in the hope that they are susceptible to some sort of reason. I'm going to preface what I say about Jeremy Corbyn by saying there's something profoundly wrong with our economic system in this country. It's best expressed as an insistence that young people keep supporting capitalism despite the fact that they are never going to have any capital unless the economy changes. And Jeremy Corbyn is the only frontline mainstream politician for a generation who appears both to recognise and to want to resolve this. I will not apologise for finding him profoundly unimpressive, but I completely understand why so many people have got so much pinned to him. This breakdown of capitalism, you're living in a capitalist society but you're never going to have any capital. That's incredibly serious. And most of us, myself included, with our blinkers on, sort of pretend, oh, everything will work itself out in the wash. The reason why people like Jeremy Corbyn is he appears to represent a genuine desire to change that system. So let's get that front and centre. There is nothing baffling about why he is so popular with so many. But to try and bring in party political point scoring yesterday with regard to this just seemed to me to be a little bit naff, actually, is probably the word I'd go for, even grubby. This is a national issue. This is not a party political issue. And while the Conservative government has questions to answer about donations that it's accepted from Russians, it was only a couple of years ago that Jeremy Corbyn was recommending Russia Today to his Twitter followers as a reliable news source that was that had less on the royal wedding and was being very objective on Libya. So, you know, I just don't like that kind of politics at times like this. It seems to me to be petty and cheap and tawdry, but obviously you will hear that if you are determined to, as yet another attack on Jeremy Corbyn by this closet Tory. 10:15 is the time. We haven't asked a question yet because I wanted to lay out all of the things that I've been thinking about and lay out all of the things that I am puzzling over, and then we lead ourselves inexorably, I think, towards this question, which is hand on heart, and we won't be able to discuss this without mentioning Trump or Brexit, but hand on heart, if it is, as the government suspects, a state-sanctioned assassination attempt on British soil, done in a way that suggests they really don't care if we work it out, that for me is the crucial thing. Done in a way that suggests they really don't fear any reprisals or repercussions that we could visit upon them. If it is, as Amber Rudd and Theresa May and Boris Johnson have concluded, if those are the events that we've witnessed this week, then Russia don't think we're capable of landing a punch on them. Putin doesn't think we're capable of responding in any meaningful way. Now, that would be the grimmest, the grisliest conclusion to arrive at. And it leads us, somewhat strangely, back to the World Cup. Phrases you don't hear me say very often. There's a brilliant piece in the Daily Mail today where they've got the editor of a German newspaper and one of their own columnists to combine forces with calls for a boycott of the Football World Cup. And I think I've changed on this. It seemed a bit petty and silly when we talked about it last week, the idea that footballers should somehow carry the can for political crises. But if we are serious about embarrassing Putin on the international stage, I'm not sure what else we can do. Anyway, give me a call. Let's just talk today. This genuinely, I'm not here to spook you unnecessarily, but this is actually incredible. As we talk about the news every day, sometimes we forget to hit the button when something genuinely out of the ordinary occurs. Hundreds of people now in Salisbury potentially exposed to the nastiest of nerve agents available to humanity. Hundreds. That's how little concern there is for British citizens from this regime in Russia. And yet, if we are to respond, 10:17 on a Tuesday morning, sitting here with some understanding of these issues, but more confusion than certainty, I don't know what we can do. I genuinely don't know what we can do. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. 21 minutes after 10. Sorry to go on. This is one of those days where I feel the need almost to treat the microphone as a political therapist. But the other thing that occurred to me yesterday as I was listening to Theresa May's speech is how rare it is now for any of us to put our hands up and say, oh, blimey, I don't know. There's this massive march towards a pungent opinion on every subject under the sun. I usually describe it as picking sides or tribalism. But sometimes you have to say, I haven't got a Scooby-Doo. This is where the denigration of expertise is so scary, because who do you turn to now? You know, we've created a country where you can send death threats to paediatricians at Great Ormond Street Hospital because some no-mark self-publicists are trying to get their faces on the telly. So security services are pretty clear that this is a Russian attack, and I don't know how we could, should, or can respond. Cameron's in Norfolk. That's a big place. Whereabouts in Norfolk are you, Cameron?
I'm about 12 miles north of Norwich, a little village called Reetham.
Lovely stuff. What do you want to say?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for your show, because...
You're very welcome.
I think you are the one voice in Britain that is waking up the younger generation to what the older generation through Brexit are doing to us. So I see it for my children. So thank you for that.
Well, oddly enough, I was trying to work out yesterday what the 10th chapter in my forthcoming book, which I've just signed for, should be, and it probably is going to be the generation gap. So I shall break the habit of a lifetime and allow that compliment to pass unchallenged. But if anybody else starts complimenting me in the course of the programme, I shall cut them off very quickly. Now, back to the business in hand.
Okay, the business in hand. The Russian situation, I think it's a dream for the Tory party. An absolute dream, because nothing unites the Tories like a good defence issue, going back to Galtieri and Argentina. Thatcher was really at the end of her political reign, and that saved her.
That's one interpretation. Certainly, I think the SDP were running very high in the polls prior to that landing at Port Stanley, and they ceased to be a potential government shortly afterwards. But well, anyway, you go on, because I think I know where you're heading with this. I'm not sure I'm going to argue with you.
Well, no, I didn't ring for an argument. I mean, it's an interesting story. I mean, whether Putin knew about this is debatable. Whether Putin knew about it. I don't know. I'll say something very, very controversial, and I can't stand by this. I know somebody who is quite high up as an undercover policeman in Northern Ireland, and after a few beers one night, he just said to me, one thing that always astounded me is how many of these random sectarian killings were sanctioned by Thatcher.
I mean, she's no longer with us, so you can't libel her. But I don't think it's hot news that some of these, people that had infiltrated terrorist organisations would be involved in crimes committed by those terrorist organisations without blowing their cover. So whether that counts as being state sanctioned, I think is moot. But
the idea that British people or people paid by the British government have killed people...
Oh, no, that's not debatable. That's established. And your mate's probably more surprised by how widely misunderstood that is than by the fact that it actually happened. But where are we going now with Russia?
Well, I think that Putin... I think the outrage that we're showing against Russia... these things happen. I think Putin is trying us out. I think Putin has got to power by posturing, by being macho, by raising pride in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think he's a very brutal man.
What can we do? Right? I'm sorry to push you down the road, but if the analysis that pretty much everybody accepts turns out to be provable, or he's got until midnight tonight to respond. I don't know what any response...
Well, has he? What are we... I mean...
that's what Theresa May said. I like you, I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute. She's sort of... she said, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough.
It's her trying to be Thatcher and stand up. I mean, I think what people don't underestimate, what people overestimate is Russia's military might. When Russia shot down a Turkish jet a few years ago, Turkey was part of NATO. Russia did nothing.
NATO did nothing.
Yes, but Turkey shot down a Russian fighter jet, and Russia did nothing in response.
It was in Turkish airspace.
Regardless of where it was,
that's international law, mate. I mean, we're covering an awful lot of ground here, and you were very complimentary at the beginning. No, stop talking. Here's the thing, Cameron. I want you to tell me what you think we can do if Vladimir Putin doesn't do what Theresa May...
We will do what we've always done. We'll expel a few diplomats, we'll put in a few trade sanctions and whatever, but it will strengthen Theresa May, and she'll then put out a big PR campaign saying she's standing up to the Russians when the Russians are constantly testing us anyway.
No, OK, I get that. I mean, you didn't think she was impressive yesterday?
Sorry?
You didn't think she was impressive yesterday?
I think that she's got a PR team behind her that wrote that, and it just sounded very strong, and it was like Thatcher in the 80s, wasn't it?
And finally... Because I think if you're going to use that line, she's got a strong PR team behind her, and she decided... I mean, that is a criticism you could level at every single speech by every single politician in history.
It is, but this landed in a lap, didn't it?
I disagree with you on that. I appreciate your thoughtfulness, but I disagree with you on that. This is a nightmare. I would argue for her, and I don't think I'm going to be shakeable from the position that she put in a very, very good parliamentary performance yesterday, albeit that Cameron suggests it might be built on sand rather than brick. It still served its purpose in the context of yesterday's session. What can we do? He's probably right. A few empty gestures. I guess the question I should have asked at the outset is, can we land a punch on Vladimir Putin? And the only punch we've really got in our arsenal is probably the World Cup. 0345 6060973, which is why it's back on the front page of the Mail today. Dan's in Penn, near Wolverhampton, if memory serves. Dan, what would you like to say?
James, yeah. Well, you're saying, what should we do? Well, surely in the first place, we shouldn't employ Russian spies to spy on our behalf. You know, I believe that's the story. Obviously Vladimir Putin is going to respond. He's going to come here and try and bump them off, and I don't blame him.
Right, so you're an apologist for Vladimir Putin's state-sanctioned assassination attempt on...
What I'm saying is that, if a Russian spy that spies on behalf of us is obviously going to put himself in the firing line.
Yes, I think I'm crikey, my introduction was long enough, but obviously I should have added some things like, if somebody risks their life to help our nation, then we have an enormous debt of gratitude and protection to them. So the first thing you should be saying, instead of making excuses for the murderers, is that we appear to have let down Sergei Skripal by not protecting him better. The defence for not protecting him better would be, well, how the hell did we know anyone was going to turn up with a nerve agent that's come from the Novichok programme in Russia? To which your response would be, Dan?
But we know the way they behave. We know the way Putin behaves.
So then the criticism is of our security services. It's a little odd that you frame it as support for Vladimir Putin.
I tend to agree with you on that one.
So when it turns out to be true, how do we respond? And I can't allow you to say, well, we should go back in time and behave completely differently 25 years ago.
I can't answer that, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, thanks for the call. It's 29 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And I mean thanks for the call, because I suspect, albeit that we had to push Dan out of his Kremlin apologism, once you move away from these slightly odd positions, there is no answer to this question. That's why Theresa May yesterday impressed me, but scared the hell out of me. She seemed to be acknowledging reality for the first time. Those of you who followed the Magnitsky Acts in their various incarnations around the world will know that we've been slow on the uptake here, and the theory is that it's because the Russians have got so much money invested in our economy, dirty money, that perhaps offers up a defence of Jeremy Corbyn's interventions yesterday. But that's the scary thing. She appears to be recognising reality, but how does she respond to that reality when, as is almost certain, Vladimir Putin either completely ignores her or responds to this ultimatum in a very dismissive and derisory way? I don't know. Dan doesn't know. You probably don't know. But we can at least worry at this little knot together until our ignorance becomes absolutely irrefutable. And that is it, I guess. As you heard in the news, this claim that we haven't given Russia access to the evidence that Theresa May drew upon when describing this nerve agent yesterday will excuse Moscow from giving any response to the ultimatum, that from the Prime Minister Sergei Lavrov. A response of sorts, you could call it. So, Theresa May have we got a clip? Because we got a little bit of Theresa May yesterday, because I genuinely thought I'm going to play you about 90 seconds of the Prime Minister yesterday. Because the fact that Cameron in Norfolk, I didn't agree with everything he said, but there is, I think within all of us, it's not just a Conservative trait. If you genuinely... If something genuinely feels like a national threat, a threat to national security, then it unites the nation like nothing else. Supposedly it does. Of course, we're living in a country at the moment where there are plenty of people who appear to, well, how can I put this politely? They appear to be so far up Vladimir Putin's backside that they think it's permanently nighttime. That's probably the politest way I can think of putting it. And they're in positions of prominence in the media and to a lesser extent in politics. But you have this notion that if there really is a threat to national security, then it unites a nation. And if you want a united nation, I think you need strong leadership.
It is now clear that Mr. Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. This is part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok. Based on the positive identification of this chemical agent by world-leading experts at the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory at Porton Down, our knowledge that Russia has previously produced this agent and would still be capable of doing so, Russia's record of conducting state-sponsored assassinations, and our assessment that Russia views some defectors as legitimate targets for assassinations, the government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Mr. Speaker, there are therefore only two plausible explanations for what happened in Salisbury on the 4th of March. Either this was a direct act by the Russian state against our country, or the Russian government lost control of its potentially catastrophically damaging nerve agent and allowed it to get into the hands of others. This afternoon, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has summoned the Russian ambassador to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and asked him to explain which of these two possibilities it is, and therefore to account for how this Russian-produced nerve agent could have been deployed in Salisbury against Mr. Skripal and his daughter.
10:38 is the time. So I suppose we have to acknowledge in these days of fake news that you could dismiss the work of our security services and our government. They're not infallible, and neither are they always trustworthy. As you don't need to refer to anything as enormous as the Iraq War to make that point. There are hundreds of examples of where the perception of the government has defined the national interest, and it's later turned out to be wrong. So I don't know what they're punting out there as theories. I've seen somebody mention Porton Down being nearby, so maybe the nerve agent came from there. And I don't obviously watch Russia Today, but no doubt they've got an interesting version of events that possibly involves us being responsible for the assassination attempt on Sergei Skripal. But let's operate, for the purposes of our conversation, our time together today, let's operate on the understanding that the best placed source is the government. And the government believe it was Russia. And the Prime Minister has issued a deadline of midnight tonight for Russia to account for the presence of this substance on a table of a pizza restaurant in Salisbury. And I don't think they're going to. And I don't know where that leaves us as a country. They're just going to cock a snook at us, blow a raspberry, laugh. Where does that leave us as a country? The EU sanctions brought in against Russia after the Ukraine annexation, the Crimean annexation, they hurt, they're powerful, but they're only powerful because there's 28 of us. We try and bring in sanctions against Russia on our own. Yeah, good luck. And then the Magnitsky Act, that would work, but that's still in need of quite a bit of heavy lifting. And also, tough for the Conservative Party. These are really, really strange times. And what's most interesting to me is the way in which it really highlights how much of our time together is spent swapping strong opinions, and we're no longer equipped for conversations as a country about unknowns, mysteries, genuine threats that don't involve picking a side based loosely upon how you feel about people with, well, different coloured skin to you. There's so much of what we've done over the last few years breaks down along those lines. This doesn't. Errol's in Woolwich. Errol, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James. You're not going to like me because I'm a Russian fan, Putin fan, I should say. But, however...
What does that mean?
Well, I mean, I like the way he acted in Syria, I think, was much better than what the West has done. That's what I mean. But without getting into that...
So coming in on Assad's side and helping him to kill... Well, hundreds of thousands of his own citizens.
If you look at what the West done in terms of arming Al-Qaeda type people,
but they didn't,
and the creation of ISIS,
but they didn't,
which is brilliant. Well, they did.
Okay, mate.
Well, I'm not going to get into it. But anyway, in terms of what May could do, there's a lot of things she could do in terms of financial system, which gets hundreds of millions, if not billions, of pounds laundered through the financial system, and that would potentially help the UK economy in terms of cleaning up the mess.
Well, except it would damage the UK economy. This is the thing that Bill Browder explained to me years ago, and I didn't really fully understand at the time why he drew Conservative Party into it, but I do now. These oligarchs, whether they're corrupt or not, and personally I'm with Balzac on this one, or Tolstoy, I can never remember which, behind every great fortune there is always a great crime. They don't spend their money in budgeons, mate. They don't spend their money in Primark. They spend their money in the kind of places where the epic wealth of this country has been concentrated for generations. And those places usually have very close ties to the Conservative Party.
Absolutely. Big property prices.
Cars, art.
They spent or accepted hundreds of thousands from Russian oligarchs, from the Conservatives. But I think that you need to definitely clamp down on that. If you can clamp down on that area, it potentially will help
the economy and, help...
Well, it won't help the economy, Errol. You have to... I appreciate that you draw your news from quite odd sources, given your admiration of Vladimir Putin, but you don't help the economy in any financial or economic sense by removing hundreds of millions of pounds from it. You actively harm the economy.
But even Theresa May has left a get-out clause for the Russians by turning around and saying maybe it was... somehow it got out without their knowing. So she's left a little door open for them.
That's what I thought initially, and I can't give you a beasting for arriving at the conclusion I arrived at, but I didn't stay at that conclusion for very long. I think she was almost taking the mickey by saying, of course, I suppose it's possible that this incredibly toxic and dangerous substance managed to move all the way from a Russian laboratory to a pub in Salisbury without being detected entirely by accident, or there's some sort of substratum of security service rogue who's decided to go and pursue a vendetta. Remember when Skripal was unveiled, when he was, it was part of a prisoner swap, and when he came to Britain, the phrase that Putin used, I think, was kick the bucket to describe what he could look forward to in the future. That's the problem here. We'll have to talk another day about your misguided admiration of Vladimir Putin's policy in Syria. Hopefully when Russia Today has its licence taken away, you'll stop being exposed to that sort of nonsensical anti-British propaganda. Carl's in Leeds. Carl, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello,
so,
Carl.
a couple of things come to mind. The responses might not be glamorous, but they're probably strong and stable.
Yeah, that's a good line.
Step one, what leverage do we have over the Russians? They really like using the City of London to clean dubious money.
Does everyone accept that now? Because it used to be quite a controversial position, or people would say, oh, blooming lefties, blooming Marxists, or I can't remember what the criticism was, but the simple explanation that you don't get £100 million out of Russia without being a wrong 'un, without being a latter-day gangster, and you shouldn't be able to come to Britain and spend it all on Ferraris and football clubs.
Eventually, when you have the same, many different sources from all kinds of places in the political spectrum reporting the same things, you've got to wonder if there might just be something behind it.
Yes.
So as far as that goes, get the serious board office, security services, treasury, everyone involved.
Well, it's already there. I mean, the Magnitsky Act is already pretty much, they've listed the names of the people who shouldn't be allowed to operate economically in this country. It's all done. It's all there. And Marina Litvinenko's, Alexander's widow, has this morning called for the government to adopt it immediately. That would hurt him. That would actually hurt Putin.
Yep, freeze the assets, any suspected money laundering, people who are looking dicey, their visas, they're staying here at Her Majesty's pleasure and the pleasure of the government, and them off. Next on the list, I suppose, it took, assuming it was Russia directly, it took intelligence operatives to do it. We know, I would hope, who at least most of them are.
Didn't one of Alexander Litvinenko's murderers end up with a chat show in Russia and I think a seat in Parliament? I may have got that wrong, but it's not a happy precedent, is it?
There is a guy who got quite famous there. However, if we kick him out, they're no longer here.
True.
And that's one less thing. And obviously the third thing is, do we really need Russian state propaganda in the UK? Probably a good time for Ofcom to take a long, hard look at Sputnik and RT.
Yes, Sputnik is the radio station. I'm not familiar with either of these outlets, but it's the same with InfoWars and Breitbart. When you don't actually keep a track of the absolute nonsense that they're spewing out on a daily basis, you end up being profoundly shocked by the number of poor saps that have ended up believing it.
The thing is, InfoWars is kind of an appropriate name for this. It is quite literally an information war.
Yeah.
And
with truth and facts on one side and propaganda and scaremongering and division on the other.
I'm sure they would say that we are doing exactly the same to them, but that's, two sides to each story. Ours is probably more right. So, yeah, that's what I would do.
Hit them with the money, hit them with the sanctions, but it won't sound sexy, as you acknowledge. I'm moving on just because I'm a little late for this. And you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we reflect, I hope calmly, upon the probable paucity of the British Prime Minister's response to Vladimir Putin's probable refusal, failure, rejection of her deadline. He's got until midnight tonight to explain how a nerve agent traced to a very specific project in Russia could have ended up in Salisbury, apparently intended to kill a former spy for Britain who was working in Russia. He wasn't a Russian spy in the sense that he wasn't doing espionage in Russia, but he had access to things that were of use to us. And 10:51 is the time. I just worry when you see the front page of the Mail, a newspaper which I hold no torch for, as you'll know, but which, like a stopped clock, is right at least twice a day in the great scheme of things. They've arrived at the World Cup as the only meaningful way to actually land a punch upon him on the world stage. The Magnitsky Act would work, but it would be slow and painstaking and hard, and it would, from a conservative point of view, involve waving goodbye to huge amounts of money, both in donations to the party, as Jeremy Corbyn pointed out yesterday, I felt inappropriately, and also, of course, as the recipients of retail largesse. If you ever meet a very, very rich Russian, and they're not all bad, I make that absolutely clear, they almost laugh now at posh Brits, because whenever a posh Brit comes into their orbit, they're always on the lam. They're always not on the lam. They're always looking for an opportunity, not a handout, but they're always trying to get the Russians to invest in something or to buy something. I think in my fifth decade, 46, the second half of my fifth decade, the thing I'm increasingly less naive about is that line in St. Paul about the love of money, because these people don't care about anything except money, and the rest of us are wasting our time thinking that they one day might. It's all about money. Everything is about money. It's all about money, and these Russians have got loads of it. So when we talk about ethical foreign policies in the context of military engagements, we should probably be talking about ethical domestic policies in the context of money laundering. So that wouldn't land a punch immediately. What can we do tonight if Putin doesn't play ball? James is in Berwick-on-Tweed. James, what would you like to say?
Oh, yeah, good morning, James. Yeah, thanks for letting me on. I'm just... I'd like to be a bit more sceptical about this line that Russia necessarily had to be behind it.
OK, Theresa May's getting her information from MI6. Where are you getting yours from?
Well, MI6 also, if you remember...
It's not a trick question. Where are you getting yours from?
Well, 45 Minutes was an MI6 thing. Do you remember that?
That was John Scarlett, and of course, what our wonderful liberal democracy has done subsequently is debunk that. So I'll ask you again, where are you getting your information from?
Well, do you know what happened then? John Scarlett became head of MI6.
Where are you getting your information from?
Well, okay. Michael Portillo, he was on a BBC programme politics programme last week. He gave this offered it as a possibility that somebody is trying.
So Michael Portillo is your source?
No. Well, he just said as a possibility someone's trying to discredit Russia. Now there are two questions. I would like to ask two questions. Why would the Russians not be able to delay doing something like this until after the World Cup that they've spent billions on?
Because they don't care.
Well, they've spent billions. You just said that everything's about money. You just said
but they don't
money.
care. They don't think we've got the cojones to pull out. I thought that was obvious. You should probably check with Michael Portillo.
Why would they risk it? Do you think it's because they're afraid of the English?
Because they look even more powerful when we start saying, well, we're like King Lear, mate, on the heath. We're saying, I shall do such things that they shall be the terror of the earth. What they are, I know not. We look pathetic, and we look even more pathetic if we don't respond accordingly. Can I ask you again what your sources are for your scepticism that sees you refute what the security services have told the Prime Minister?
As I said, I just
Michael Portillo.
I just told you, Michael Portillo.
Okay.
He said it was.
So he suggested that Theresa May. I was in bed last night. He suggested Theresa May was lying yesterday, did he?
No, what he said is he just offers as a possibility that some spy agency or somebody is trying to discredit Russia. And the other
with a nerve agent you can only get in Russia.
Well, that is one of the things that points to it, isn't it? After all, I mean, it's not exactly
points to what, mate?
It's not the most subtle way of doing away with somebody, is it?
They have utter contempt for us. That's why. They don't want it to be subtle, do they? What's the point of murdering somebody who without everybody knowing that you've murdered him? The only circumstances you do that is if you fear the country in which you're doing it. So the reason why they've been even more brazen now than they were with Alexander Litvinenko is because Putin considers us to be even weaker than we were then. What was your second question?
Okay. Why would they do something that attracts all this attention and points directly to them? Not everybody, incidentally, goes along with the Laurel and Hardy thesis on Litvinenko, the idea that they contaminated themselves and left a trail, a glow-in-the-dark trail for Scotland Yard to follow.
Again, where do you do... well, the answer would be the same. If you hold this country in utter contempt and are aware that what Theresa May described as international relations after the Litvinenko investigation was completed would prevent her from pursuing a more robust response, it's It's called cocking a snook. It's called laughing in our faces.
So why not wait until after the World Cup?
Because they're laughing in our faces. And again, I mean, these conversations are just weird. What do you think you're sort of doing? You're sticking up for mystery spies who tried to kill a bloke in Salisbury for reasons that Michael Portillo didn't mention on the telly last night. Do you not know what you sound like?
Well, I mean, there is a lot more to this world.
What motivates you, James? Well, when you get up in the morning and you're given... I appreciate that sometimes governments lie to us, sometimes they mislead us, but they generally do so in what they sometimes mistakenly believe to be the national interest. You sound like one of those blokes who's built a bunker in the woods because you think that the world's going to end at the end of next year. What inspires your enthusiasm for these odd theories?
I'm a Remainer, James. We're on the same page on a lot of things. But
I'm not talking about that. What inspires your enthusiasm for these weird theories? Why would you get up in the morning and go out looking for a weird theory?
Your colleague, Ian Dale, there is very interesting.
So that's Michael Portillo, Ian Dale. I just want to talk to you.
Yeah, I'm telling you, James, we should ramp up defence spending, he was just saying there. Well, that's interesting. Do you know how serious the homelessness...
You've had your fun. You've had your fun, James. Have a great day. Igor is in Moscow. Oh, my days. Igor, are you allowed to talk to me?
Yes, I think I am. Thank you.
What would you like to say?
Yeah, I'd like to say I don't see what UK can do which haven't been done before. There was the Magnitsky Act which went after Russian dirty money and it haven't deterred Putin from attacking Ukraine.
No, it hasn't. It hasn't been introduced here.
Well, do you think it would make a difference if it were? Do you think there would be no Ukraine if it were introduced there?
So does Putin. That's why he hates it so much. That's why Bill Browder, its architect, keeps getting arrested and then released on the Russian interventions with Interpol.
So Putin's afraid that UK would do it.
But Putin's only afraid of one thing, and that's not being able to get his hands on all the money that he's stolen. You know this.
Well, isn't that...
And that's what the Magnitsky Act would do. It would prevent all of his cronies and placemen, his bagmen. Wasn't there a fella in the Panama Papers who had £2 billion salted away, and he was a sort of obscure musician who was one of Putin's old friends? He needs these people out there and spending in order to exercise the wealth that he's stolen from your country. So the Magnitsky Act frightens him. But whether or not we can bring it in quickly enough and effectively enough to make it look like a proper response to this state-sanctioned assassination attempt, I don't know.
Okay, if it frightens him, then how much sense does it make that he would order such a assassination in such a bizarre manner, which
well, that's where the pathology comes in, isn't it? And he's already explained that himself. I don't know if these interviews get reported in Russia. I presume that they do because they're very much for a domestic audience. When Skripal was handed over as a prisoner, Vladimir Putin explained that these people will kick the bucket one day. They can all expect to die. So that's his ego and his sociopathic nature on the one hand, and then you've got his greed and his financial corruption on the other. Do me a favour, stick this on a tape and go and broadcast it out of your window in Moscow. Oddly, I forgot to tell you about some of the other stuff that I want to talk about today. The Church of England is in the news for suggesting that pupils in schools should be taught that abstinence and celibacy are positive life choices. Hopefully we'll have time to talk about that today. Remember, we've got the spring statement coming up shortly with Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, so that may rather overtake events, in which case, will you give me a heads up tomorrow? We'll talk about celibacy tomorrow, because I find that fascinating. Also, the notion of churches interfering in sexual choice, interfering or seeking to influence sexual choices is always fertile territory for us. I don't think there's any word yet from the White House. Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, American Secretary of State, has issued a harsh condemnation of Russia following this nerve agent attack on a former Russian spy in the United Kingdom. But the White House, for reasons that I don't think are very difficult to work out unless you have fallen completely under the spell of the snake oil, the White House not following suit. But if that changes, I'll bring it to your attention. It has to change, I would have thought, at some point today. Donald Trump is going to have to say something about his special relationship, his closest NATO ally, his good friend. He, after all, is the man that's going to rescue us from the economic impacts of Brexit, which you just heard in the news have currently got us at the was it the worst performing economy in the G20 predicted? Was that the headline in the news? Never mind, unicorns on the way. And a few of you expressing a degree of unhappiness and indeed scepticism regarding how many people in this country could have ended up somehow siding with Vladimir Putin's Russia. against, our sovereign nation? And I think the answer to that is media. I can't see what else it is. Not just the weird corners of the media that we have only really noticed the influence of a little bit too late, but also the ones that look real and respectable. We all get calls from Russia today. And Press TV, are they still in business? The ones that are run by the Iranian regime. And this notion that somehow calling for propaganda outlets to be closed is an assault upon free speech, that would be like claiming that telling a bloke who's standing up in a crowded cinema shouting fire when there isn't one is an assault upon free speech. You've got to get this the right way round. You're not free to march around the place telling dangerous lies. That's not freedom of speech. So when you get the calls from these outfits, and I know in this line of work a lot of people like to get their faces on their telly or get their names on the radio or whatever it may be, but I can tell you, hand on heart, it's very easy to say no. If it's a financial issue, don't ask what the fee is, because that will only make it hard. Hello, James, it's Russia Today here. I wonder if you'd like to come on and talk about... No, thank you, goodbye. Block number. Don't say what's the fee if you're made that way, if you're a little bit kind of, if your head gets turned. Because the fees, I'm told, are quite high. Got the call from Press TV a few years ago. No, thank you. You're funded by an extremist, oppressive regime in Iran. I've got problems with Al Jazeera because of the way they're funded by Qatar, which is a country with enormous questions to answer about human rights abuses and social justice. But hey, guess where the next World Cup is after the one in Russia? Oh, yeah. The mighty Qatar. We're going to boycott that one too. So I'm going to carry on for a while with this conversation. I also, if we can, want to get onto that celibacy issue and two stories which I felt work together really well. I don't know if you heard Nick yesterday talking about this playground that is deliberately dangerous. It's a really good story where children have been essentially given logs, hammers, hand saws, the kind of things that most parents would balk at. But they've introduced them at break time at this primary school in Essex, and so far the responses are all good. And I couldn't help seeing that in relief to another story in the Telegraph today about a crazy golf birthday party that ended with a 10-year-old described as boisterous, a 10-year-old blinding his 9-year-old friend with a golf club. His mother, the mother of the swinger of the golf club, is now facing a 6-figure compensation bill. And I couldn't help thinking that's the reason why playgrounds generally don't look like this one in Essex. But we might try, if we can, to sort of map the impact of this change. Apart from money, apart from property prices and sort of food issues, the biggest change between my childhood and my children's childhood, I think, is probably this notion of not encouraging them to do dangerous stuff. I really do. And I wonder how it's affecting us. I sometimes wonder whether it's linked to the epidemic levels of anxiety and issues like that children suffer from these days as well. The fact that we're not actually exposing them to genuine danger, so they lose the ability to identify what is genuine danger. 9 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A couple more calls on this Russian thing. I think can I say screwed? I think we're screwed. I just don't see how we as a country that has, for the first time in history, voted to be less well-off and less secure. I can't think of any democratic vote in history that's done that in the past. How we can stand up to the most powerful man on the planet, all on our lonesome. So if... he's not going to respond, is he? They've called in our ambassador in Moscow. So we want to see the evidence. They're playing with us. Absolutely sort of like a cat with a mouse. But if you can think of a way in which that mouse could roar, I want to hear it. 0345 6060973. Mo's in Hatfield. Mo, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you, mate. How are you?
Thank you for no, not too bad. Thank you for taking my call.
You're welcome.
The thing is, I just don't understand how people accept that a foreign country performed like a chemical attack in Britain and they're okay with it. And they're defending Putin, which is astonishing, to be honest.
Well, we've had quite a warming up process for this. You know, there are people in public life in Britain that have spoken of their admiration for Vladimir Putin, people who generally leave their their morals at the door, but the effort that's put into washing him on social media, the number of Russian bots is incredible now. So there is a grooming process that the British public has been exposed to, and you see it on some of these weird websites as well, because he's an authoritarian, because he is quite comfortable saying on telly things like, well, maybe it's the Jews that did it. How do they know it was the Russians? You can see who finds him attractive, Mo. You don't need me to join the dots.
Yeah, you're right, but this is alarming, because if no one can stood against him, it's really problematic, isn't it?
Well, yes, but that's the whole point about misinformation, isn't it? It doesn't matter where we end up as long as we don't know what's true anymore, and that's pretty much what's happened in the West.
I think that at least we should boycott the World Cup. This is at least.
Do you on our own?
Sorry?
Could send Jamie Carragher. That would send them a message, wouldn't it? I don't know if we should boycott the World Cup on our own.
No, it should be a world effect, just like.
And then we'd have to, I suppose. I mean, what if the German government turned?
You know, the previous caller, he said he's admired Putin for his action in Syria.
Yeah.
Which is very alarming. I think it's in the opposite. We should arm the rebel just to piss off the.
I'm not sure I'm comfortable with your language on that occasion, but we'll let it pass because I don't think the phone line was strong enough. Look, we dropped the ball on Syria. Again, I'd blame Tony Blair for that. I think all of the conditions that we were told were in place prior to the invasion of Iraq did actually apply to Syria, but because Iraq went so horribly wrong and that information or intelligence turned out to be deeply, deeply flawed, we were once bitten, twice shy. But the responsibility for that lies on the other side of the house, I think. Ed Miliband led that, didn't he? Didn't he lead that resistance? I'm not sure, but yes, I take your point. The previous caller expressing admiration for Putin's behaviour in Syria is clearly getting his news from some of these deeply, deeply corrupt sources, but of course suggesting that they shouldn't be able to promulgate and propagate lies is now framed as an assault upon freedom of speech by precisely the people who've swallowed the lies. What a tangled web we weave. Richard is in Liss in Hampshire. Richard, what would you like to say?
First, I'd like to say thank you very much for your show.
I said this is terribly unfair of me, but I said the next person to do that would get a ticking off, because if one person does it, everybody else thinks it's a convention, and it isn't. So thank you, but no thank you. Carry on.
I'm genuinely learning a lot.
Stop it! Stop it! Carry on.
Right. I can't really weigh in on the politics side of it, but I would weigh in on the sports side.
Yes.
Should we, for example, all the European countries, NATO countries, whatever, pull out of the World Cup, it will make not an iota of difference for Vladimir Putin. I'll tell you why. Vladimir Putin adores ice hockey. He adores winning. That's the way he is. This year at the Winter Olympics, the National Hockey League, which is the NHL, which is the greatest league in the world, which has all the stars, did not release its players for the Olympics. Now, Russia won gold medal, and Putin was over the moon. In Sochi...
Are you sure? I mean, I'm a bit thick on this. I didn't follow it that closely, but I thought that Russia weren't allowed to compete except as independent athletes.
Oh, no, they were, but if you look at their team, Russian independent athletes, they're all players from the KHL, which is the Continental Hockey League, which is a very, very good level of standard.
Well, you're educating me now, but and also, of course, he's quite happy to cheat in pursuit of victory, which was proved during the Sochi investigations.
But so the problem we've got is the NHL released the players in Sochi, and Russia was embarrassed. They didn't even get a medal. Now, I'm surprised, I genuinely am, that someone's head didn't roll on that the same way someone in Colombia did in the World Cup all those years ago.
But what about Berlin in '36, the Olympics and the humiliation of Adolf Hitler? That worked. Well, I appreciate it didn't exactly prevent the Second World War, but it was an effective policy, wasn't it?
It was, and I think I'm not sure if Hitler was an avid sports fan the same way Putin is. Putin really, really, like, his ice hockey team for him is his baby. It's unbelievable. And if we pulled out of the World Cup, for example, and all the NATO countries pulled out, and Russia won the World Cup, we'd be over the moon.
That's a really good point. And I don't know if it's true, but I'm going to take your word for it. And I'm not sure I got the Berlin 1936 Olympics the right way round. I'm trying to No, I got it completely the wrong way around. I was trying to précis the article in the Mail today by the editor-in-chief of Bild newspaper. He writes, "We bear responsibility for hosting the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin, which did so much to legitimise Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in the eyes of the world." So mea culpa on that one, but that does refute your point. So you're saying even if no one turns up and he still wins, he'll be happy. The Hitler parallel brought in by the editor of one of Germany's best-selling newspapers suggests that isn't true. The worst thing we could do is go, because that legitimises the regime.
Well, at the end of the day, the Olympics have changed, they've evolved, and it's nowhere near as important as it was back in the day, if you wish. It really was a flex of the muscles of the different countries to say, look at our athletes. It's not the case anymore, because every sport is on the world stage at other sort of tournaments. I don't believe that the Olympics will be a way of bringing the world together the way it used to.
I mean, yeah, it's the World Cup, not the Olympics, but the point stands.
Yeah, so if he won the World Cup, Russia won the World Cup. I don't even know if they've ever won it.
No,
but if they did, I mean, he's going to be over the moon with that. He's won again.
That's a really interesting point. I've enjoyed today, because we don't have to argue the toss on everything, but I'm just going to leave that one hanging. Is that even if Russia were the only team in it, if they won gold medal, Putin's so mad. Putin, Trump and Kim Jong-un, seriously, they're like the Marx Brothers. It's incredible, isn't it, that these three people are in charge of three potentially nuclear powers. But yeah, you're right, he's so mad that even if they're the only team in it, he'll still do a lap of honour with his gold medals.
Well, he would, because he did it at the Olympics this year, and with the ice hockey, which was a disgrace, because really, if the NHL had participated, Russia probably wouldn't have gotten anywhere near the gold medal.
I've allowed you to explore your passion for ice hockey on this programme for long enough, Richard. I don't want you to lose the room, but I like the analysis of Putin. How many teams are in the World Cup this year? They're Russia versus the rest of the world. We will win. It's like an escape to victory, isn't it? That the idea that the prestige of the regime is enhanced simply by our presence. It doesn't matter to people like Vladimir Putin. Even if they win in the most corrupt of circumstances, they'll still march around. I've got a friend like that on FIFA. Cheats like you wouldn't believe on FIFA. Just psychological warfare, pausing it, going to the toilet when I'm winning, trying to distract me, making phone calls, and which means, in my mind, when he wins, it should feel like a cheapened victory, but he doesn't feel it's cheapened at all. He high-fives himself all the way around the room. It's 11:18, where I'll take a couple more calls on this. If I throw in a Jeremy Corbyn question, can we play nicely or not? It's entirely up to you. I don't think Jeremy Corbyn was right to bring in the donations to the Conservative Party by Russians yesterday, the £820,000. I felt that it was a time of national unity and security that was being discussed, and he seemed to me to oscillate between suggesting that we should stop being so bellicose towards Russia, stop being so warlike, we should be more peaceable and diplomatic, while simultaneously suggesting that taking money off people from that country was deeply wrong. I think that's bad optics, but if you want to explain to me why it isn't, I'd love to, as long as you can, keep it friendly, I'd love to hear from you. Prime Minister stands up, describes a state-sanctioned assassination attempt upon our own soil, or at least her government's belief that is what happened. Leader of the opposition says, yes, but you've taken money off people from that country. That's just bad, right? 0345 60 60973. Staying with Putin for now. Nyla is in Farnborough. Nyla, what would you like to say?
Hello.
Hello.
I just want to say, I don't really listen to your radio, to be honest.
What?
And I'm usually listening to the music, you see.
Fair enough.
So,
I could sing if you want.
No, please
No,
don't.
all right.
Sing what? It's
No,
fine.
quite right.
I got into this conversation. I just heard people, and I thought, oh my God, I have to call. So I've called in to say, and whoever says that Putin, whatever he does, is okay,
yes,
it's really not okay, and it's disheartening for, someone like me, because I am a Muslim, and I feel like I'm a British Muslim, I'm proud to be British, and I wouldn't want anybody to harm any person in this country, Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, whatever. I wouldn't want anybody in this country to be harmed. So if somebody is harming your country, it does hurt. So, and anybody against humanity,
yes,
like whatever's happened to these spies, and no one deserves to be killed. I just feel that
So what you have heard, Nyla, I'm so glad you were listening today, because what you've heard is people contacting London's biggest conversation, this radio station, in case you weren't aware of what you were listening to. And you've heard them essentially trying to excuse or even approve of an attempted murder that could have exposed hundreds of British citizens to hazard and harm. But even if it hadn't done, if you don't protect everybody, who's going to be next? That's what you're thinking. If we don't...
Exactly.
Crikey, I feel schooled. You're absolutely right.
No, because I think it's because I'm not so political, and I'm just looking at it like just a normal person.
The word I would use would be humanitarian. You've come at it from the humanitarian angle. If we don't get cross about them trying to murder this fella, then what the hell happens next? When do we get cross?
Exactly, but when we do it, and then you know what? I feel like every time something happens, like if it's a Muslim person's done something, I get so angry, and I'm like, oh God, why would you say that? Why would you blame your religion for doing something so awful?
Yes.
But then I feel that when those Syrian children, I mean, I've been watching the news and they're being blown up and they're crying and whatever.
Yes.
And if my child's got a temperature, I'm so worried, and I feel like people should at least think about the human and say, that's wrong. That is wrong what they're doing to them. And no one said, a lot of my friends say it, and all my friends are white. So I feel like, oh, thank God I'm in a nice community. And then I feel like I hear men like that saying, oh, I think he's done quite well. What has he done well, mister? I'm sorry, I don't agree.
Well, I don't think, I mean, you're picking on Errol, but I don't think Errol necessarily had, put this politely, probably didn't know that Putin allows Assad to use sarin on his own people.
Yeah, but then...
Because he's probably getting his news from sources that are designed to create precisely the environment you've just described so brilliantly, and I've missed. It's this idea that if you can just undermine the notion of a moral compass, the notion of shared values, you as a Muslim Briton talking to me as a Brit with some Irish heritage, we have shared values, and that's what's being eroded. Which is how you end up in a place where someone can phone a radio station in Britain and start sticking up for a murderer in the Kremlin.
Exactly. And I was just glad that when you answered to him and said, like politely that, you've obviously got the wrong information, it just feels so, like, oh, thank God somebody spoke for us. And it shouldn't be like that.
No, and of course, pointing out that it's the wrong information and suggesting that the people who are telling the lies should be prevented from telling the lies has now become an assault upon free speech. If I were you, I'd keep listening to music. It's even worse than you think, Nyla.
Oh, bless you.
but
you do. You listen to it, and then you start asking yourself questions that, what are we doing? What's going to happen next? And, are these people going to be excused because you've taken some money and they've supported you? But Syria's obviously not supported you, so we shouldn't support them then. And it's like, it's okay. And I just think everybody should have a mouth. We've got a voice. We should speak.
And we should try and... and as a country, we should try and speak with one voice, especially when it is a threat upon our soil undertaken by a hostile state, by an enemy state. But, Nyla, I hate to break it to you, but if you keep the radio on for long enough, you'll hear people presenting programmes on this station who seem to have some sort of fetish for Vladimir Putin. So I leave you with that warning. 28 minutes after 11 is the time. David is in Palmer's Green. David, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'd like to start this by saying I'm actually incredibly left-leaning.
You've only got a minute, but I understand why you've established that. Now crack on.
Okay. I think Putin is clearly by far the best leader Russia has ever had. If you look at the history of Russian leadership, if you read something like Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, to read what Russia was really like during communism, or read about the history before communism, these are people who've had it really, really tough. And he's taken them to a place they've never been before. And the idea that we could have someone who abides by my liberal values leading Russia is absolute fantasy. They'd be murdered.
Okay, is that it?
Pretty much.
Okay. Well, good luck. It's just gone 11:29. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. So I suppose you have to pick a side there. You're either with Nyla or you're with Dodgy Dave in Palmer's Green. It's coming up to 11:30. The conversation, what should we talk about next? Do you want to talk about celibacy? I'm hearing some slightly troubling reports from Westminster where it would appear that, well, we know that police have cordoned off a floor of MPs' offices. Is it still cordoned off? As they probe the third and fourth suspicious packages sent to Parliament in just 2 days. Just referring back to Nyla's call, I think the MPs who've been in receipt of these suspicious packages are Muslim MPs. We'll look into that a little bit closer. I know that the Bedford MP, Mohammed Yassin, was the recipient of one of them yesterday, although it was found to be non-harmful, I would stress, and I think Rupert Hook is one of the people today. There have been claims that the package sent to Mr Yassin might have been linked to that vile Punish a Muslim Day flyer, which has been put through letterboxes across the country, but I don't know yet. We'll find out more as and when we do. 11:30 is the time. National security. So, look, I'm going to talk, and I may stop at some point and invite you to talk, but at this point in proceedings, I can't guarantee it. There are 3 positions, as far as I can tell, currently being pursued by Her Majesty's opposition with regard to Her Majesty's government's conviction that Russia attempted to murder 2 people in Salisbury and could end up responsible for the deaths of 3, depending upon how the conditions of Sergei Skripal, his daughter, and a serving British police officer transpire. Those 3 positions seem to me to be the one that Jeremy Corbyn laid out in the House of Commons yesterday, which I felt he got wrong on tone more than content. And I've spent a lot of time poring over the transcript of it. And you know what I do, usually. I'll see what the front page of the Daily Mail does, and then I will swim furiously, honestly, sincerely and decently in precisely the opposite direction. But it would be foolish to believe that even a stopped clock can't be right twice a day, to coin one of my favourite phrases. And what Jeremy Corbyn was effectively saying was that this is all awful, and if it is Russia, that's bad too. But he held back from endorsing the Prime Minister's insistence that it was Russia on the grounds, I calculate, on the grounds that he hadn't yet seen compelling enough proof, evidence. And I don't think that's massively unreasonable yet. I don't think suggesting that some form of international independent organisation, and I find it astonishing how quickly Twitter becomes full of experts on the OPWC when presumably 24 hours ago none of us really had heard of it. But as a given, OK, you have now a situation where Jeremy Corbyn is simply suggesting that we should be 150% confident of our proof. I personally, look, this is all about beliefs and opinions. I personally believe that Theresa May has seen compelling enough evidence to prompt her to make the statement that she made in the House of Commons, and I don't therefore completely follow why it is so outrageous of Jeremy Corbyn to suggest that he'd quite like to see it as well. He didn't, in the real meta-analysis of the speech, he didn't condemn Russia. However you might try to cook it, he didn't condemn Russia, but again, in his defence, there is an argument that he can't until he's seen whatever it is that Theresa May has seen. As a member of the Privy Council, you'd expect him to be, that's what the word privy means, isn't it? I only just realised that. You'd expect him to be privy to the information. It's almost as disappointing as Cobra, standing for Cabinet Office Briefing Room A rather than something like Smersh or Spectre. So I get that. Then you have this quite odd development yesterday. I don't know how much these sort of things resonate outside the bubble, but the Press Association named Jeremy Corbyn's spokesman, the former Guardian journalist Seamus Milne, who is widely regarded as being a great friend of Russia, a great admirer of Russia. Whether that's fair or not, I don't actually know, but certainly history suggests that in 2015 he described Vladimir Putin as a centrist. And he's advising Jeremy Corbyn. My God, what have we done to our country? And then you have the intervention from him, named by the Press Association, which essentially cast doubt upon the reliability of our own security services, and I think suggested that we do Russia's bidding and send them a sample of this nerve agent so that they can undertake their own analysis. Now, I usually vainly attempt on days like today to find some little hooks upon which we can all hang our hats. There's small areas upon which we can all agree. It's going to be very tricky today, but if you honestly believe that our own security services are somehow less trustworthy and less reliable than Vladimir Putin's, then I think you're beyond help. I really do. The idea that we send them a sample. I don't know how much of the 21st century you've missed, but if I had to pick something really simple and emblematic of their relationship with reality and truth versus ours, which is flawed and far from perfect, I would just refer you to the wee-wee pipe. Actually, the pipe into the laboratory in Sochi where clean urine was pumped so that they could undertake drug test fraud on an industrial scale. State sanctioned. That's how they operate. They are liars and cheats and frauds. The government, not the people. The people of Russia are more sinned against than sinning. 9 minutes after 10 is the time. And then you have, which I presume is still in place, it's been in place for about an hour and 9 minutes, the position of the Labour Party's defence spokesperson, the Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, who has spoken this morning and hopefully will speak to us. Her name is Nia Griffith. About how their party position now is complete support for the Prime Minister. Now, this exhortation that we receive daily, whether we're discussing footballers spitting out of cars, whether we're discussing babies with incurable diseases in Great Ormond Street, whatever it is we're discussing, this constant exhortation to pick a side and start shouting and screaming, surely can't work on a day like today, you might think, when everything is so confused. And everything is so confused, and the issue at hand is national security. But yeah, it is. We're screaming and we're picking sides, and it seems to have an awful lot to do with Jeremy Corbyn today. I know a little bit more about Russian intervention in Western matters than perhaps I would have done if I hadn't got interested in it 3 or 4 years ago. I've been in a room with Anna Nemtsova, the daughter of Boris Nemtsov, who was murdered on that bridge in Moscow, a political rival to Vladimir Putin. I've seen some of these men and women whose lives have been ruined, whose loved ones have been killed. And I have no doubt in my mind that Vladimir Putin runs essentially a mafia organisation that is utterly, utterly removed from anything we would recognise as governed by law. But I can't quite get on board. I thought I had, actually, but you've given me pause this morning. I can't quite get on board with the absolute certainty that Corbyn was wrong simply to suggest that we needed the proof double-checking. I don't think we should be publishing our, modes of measuring, our secrets, anything that might be sensitive in terms of espionage or national security. But I don't think that Jeremy Corbyn yesterday was quite the puppet or the stooge that the Daily Mail and the Sun would have you believe today. I think Seamus Milne perhaps deserves a lot of this opprobrium. And of course, he is the official spokesman for Jeremy Corbyn, so I don't know how you separate the two, but I suspect that the Press Association's decision yesterday to name the spokesman, which is more or less unprecedented in these sort of contexts, gives us an idea that there is a distinction between the two positions. All right, that's enough waffle. Phone lines are open. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And part of me wants to invite you just to ring in and talk about it, but at risk of sounding ungrateful, I don't want to talk to barroom experts today, and yet I'm not sure who that leaves. So what I'm interested in is examining your thought processes rather than necessarily your conclusions. And I've got two thoughts on that. Phone lines are open. If you're buying into this line, that's an unfair way of putting it. If you are supporting the suspicion that we can't trust our security services because of Iraq, because of the dodgy dossier, I don't understand what you think the end game is. When the head of the Joint Intelligence Committee, Sir John Scarlett, I think he came under political pressure from Tony Blair to sex up that dossier, and I think he acquiesced to it. That's just my opinion, based on Chilcot and the other report. And that was because Tony Blair believed that going to war against Saddam Hussein was justified before he actually had the evidence for doing it. He would have pointed at some of the gassing of Kurds, some of the sort of chucking people in the paper shredders, all that sort of thing, and seen it, A, as justified on some sort of moral level, and B, as politically expedient, because George W. Bush was hell-bent on it, and Tony Blair knew that nothing was going to stop George W. Bush piling in, and perhaps the damage that would be done could be minimised by the British presence. So there's a rationale to the sexing up of the dodgy dossier. It's also a reflection upon the power of our liberties and values that we now know some of what went on during those processes and the names of the people involved. You think you'd get that in Russia? Then you're living in cloud Kremlin land. So I'd like you to talk to me about that, actually, because Twitter, which is only a window on the world, it's by no means a completely objective and reliable perspective, but it provides more diversity than normal people can ever get, because normal people, of course, don't have the pleasure and privilege of presenting a radio phone-in show every morning. But Twitter seems to be alive with the idea that we can't trust Theresa May when she tells us what the government scientists in government laboratories in relationship with our intelligence services have concluded. We can't trust that science because we know that Tony Blair put pressure on his Joint Intelligence Committee chief to make the case for war in Iraq more compelling, the changing in words, the idea that the 45 minutes, stuff that have subsequently been found to be untrue. So I don't want to fight with you today. I apologise for calling you Corbyn disciples on Twitter. That's not helpful language. But if you're really buying into this notion that we shouldn't trust Theresa May when she describes science, because we couldn't trust Tony Blair when he described a recorded case of embellishing and polishing and sexing up a dossier which made a case for war. Unless you think Theresa May has embarked upon some mysterious path towards war with Russia, in which case you're beyond help. Unless there is some clever analysis that currently eludes me, in which case please share it with me. Because, I appreciate an awful lot of people have bought into this theory already, which means it may well prove to be right, but it seems to me to be bonkers. The idea that because Sir John Scarlett whizzed up that so-called dodgy dossier, Theresa May is also lying about what happened in Salisbury. It's nuts, right? Now that you've heard it laid out like that? I appreciate when you're in the fever of social media and when Jeremy's getting a kicking and you're keen to gallop to his rescue and protection. It's nuts to suggest, A, that we could somehow trust Russian intelligence to analyse this material in a way that we can't trust our own, which I think is close to where Seamus Milne is this morning, and B, that because a previous regime was so persuaded of the need to go to war in Iraq that it manipulated the British public into a position of broad support, then somehow we can't trust Theresa May when she talks to us about the poison that has consigned a serving British police officer to what may yet prove, please God no, may yet prove to be his deathbed. It is 21 minutes after 10, and I hope it's not the wrong question to be asking this morning. I'd like to know if you're buying into this idea that we can't trust Theresa May or the intelligence services because the dodgy dossier that was used to take us into Iraq. It's clear what the dodgy dossier was designed to achieve. What do you think Theresa May is seeking to achieve dishonestly if you're buying into this, to my mind, completely bogus comparison? 22 minutes after 10 is the time. Vasily is in Poplar. Vasily, what would you like to say? Is that a Russian name?
Oh, yes, it is. I've got a Russian ethnic background. Yeah. Hello, James. First of all, I would like to say that I really appreciate your sharpness of argument.
No, I'm going to have to ban this now, otherwise we're going to lose half our show with people being kind to me. Just crack on with the point you've rung in to make, okay?
No, yes, absolutely. But the point that I'm trying to make is that today we seem like lost that sharpness. And the rationale behind it is this. the Prime Minister's position is that of we need to condemn Russia, and rightly so, because we have a great suspicion that Russia is behind this attack.
No, the Prime Minister has a conviction, not a suspicion, based upon the evidence that she's seen.
That she's seen, exactly.
Yes.
And you were saying today how important it is, the British system of the rule of law, and how you compare that to
Well,
the
I haven't actually.
Well, sorry, but...
I appreciate that this is what's on the crib sheet, but that's not what I said.
That's the sense I had from
Yes, well, let's talk about the sense you had rather than the words I used then, Vasily. That would be agreeably.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And,
the Pravda.
Yeah, and I reckon that this is the important point, that we need to make the open and thorough investigation rather than just finger pointing. It's a murder or attempted murder, and it's a criminal act, and therefore all the normal legal proceedings have to take place.
Absolutely. So could you refer me to a parallel example then of a criminal investigation where the investigating authorities or indeed the right up to the Home Office or the Foreign Office lay out all the evidence they've got for any Tom, Dick or Harry to see while the investigation is still underway?
Then,
especially if it's sensitive and forensic and chemical. Can you just give me one example of a case in recent British history, or actually no, in recent Russian history also, that would work, where the investigating authorities share all of their evidence with the general public?
I think I can make an opposite example where they didn't.
No, I don't want you to do what they didn't. I want you to give me an example of where it happens, because you've, if I've understood the sense of your words, correctly. Carry on.
I don't think such example exists, and I think.
But you've just said that that's how we operate under the rule of law.
No, that's how.
And now you said you haven't got a single example of it happening, Vasily.
That's how we should be operating under the rule of law.
So all criminal investigations should take place with all of the evidence being in the public domain?
Well, eventually.
And you think this would be a really good moment in British history to completely change every single convention under which we operate and do things in an entirely new way?
Sorry, James. I didn't say lay it down all arguments on the table now, but you're right to say, for example, the people like Jeremy could have been given access to the relevant information, when, that story with the Parliament discussion, not just demand.
Well, we've moved a bit now, haven't we?
No, not really. I was saying that a criminal investigation needs to take place, and eventually, in a court of law, the arguments need to be laid down. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Vasily. You've got enormous faith in how these things work, because the bloke who murdered Alexander Litvinenko is a member of the Duma now, isn't he?
Can I just point out?
So I was looking for a yes or no. Paul's in Rotherhithe. Paul, what would you like to say?
Yeah, morning, James.
Hello,
it's just my exasperation, with what I've been hearing on LBC for the last few days.
Not on my watch, pal.
Well, just the people that are ringing in generally on the different shows, on the Bell shows, the Cambridge academic last night that was kind of defending the indefensible.
Well, I don't. But bearing in mind, I don't get to listen to as much of my friends and colleagues as I might like to. So you're going to have to fill me in a little bit. Are we talking about people who sound as if they are defending Russia?
Yeah, absolutely they are. Yeah, and I'm just thinking this is a case of national security we're talking about here, the defence of the realm. This is not like a Remain Brexit argument, which I see the divisions in this country, but these are the useful idiots. These kind of
steady on, because, it's not helpful, is it? Because you might have rung me up and said similar about Iraq, and then it turns out that all of the people who were urging caution and saying we need more evidence were actually right. So I don't want to blindly rush to end the tea, which is why I'm keen to understand why anybody what the reason would be for Theresa May to be less than honest, what people think her end game might be if they think she is being dissembling. But your frustration is born of the belief that Russia is a rogue state, I presume.
Well, absolutely, it's a kleptocracy, isn't it? I mean,
yes. Well, the evidence is there. The evidence is all there. But you have to remember, and you mentioned Brexit. Weirdly, what you have now I say this reluctantly because no one's going to like it, but what you have now, you have that weird... Has anyone from UKIP claimed yet that it's all a government conspiracy to stop Brexit from happening? If they haven't, where is it? 10:27. Well, have you heard that yet on the radio?
Nigel's not mentioned that yet. No,
that'll be in before 10:30, no doubt. I think, what's that? Apparently one former UKIP parliamentary candidate has already made this claim. So you've got those lunatics.
Okay.
And then you've got the ones who seem to think, and I am going to put Seamus Milne's fans in this category, who seem to think that we can trust Russia, but because of Iraq, we can't trust MI6.
Well, yeah, this is exactly the point, yeah. I mean, this is what annoys me so much with left-wing politics in this country. They ignore the narrative of what Russia is. This is well, there's nothing left.
There's nothing left-wing about Russia, but you can't just pick on the left-wingers, mate. The UKIPers who speak about how much they fancy Vladimir Putin, I don't think they'd sit comfortably under the description of being left-wing, do you?
Well, maybe.
Donald Trump loves him, mate. Donald Trump thinks he's great.
Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. We shall see. Paul, thank you. I share much of your frustration. Also, I mean, he's right to mention left-wing in relation to Russia. Russia is probably the least left-wing country on the planet, with the possible exception of the Democratic Republic of North Korea. It's a police state. It's a kleptocracy. It's a completely corrupt country. You don't believe me? Just have a look at what would happen to a journalist like me in Russia. I'd have been dead before breakfast. And people seek to describe it in terms that recognise democracy, liberalism, or left-wing politics. I've got to be honest with you, I think, and I know a lot of you take an interest in my own political journey, so I hope I'm not being self-serving or too self-referential. I think the reason why I've not been able to get on board with Corbyn is this suspicion or knowledge that this kind of thing was bubbling away under the surface all the time. The domestic agenda, I would sing from the rooftops. Redistribution of wealth, a degree of renationalisation, taxation designed, because taxation is the only way you can properly redistribute wealth. Focus on the NHS, look at schools, help people that need help the vulnerable. Behave like decent human beings with a Christian background, regardless of what your beliefs may be. I am fully paid up for all of that. Bring home ownership within the reach of the younger generation. Spank people like me a little bit harder so that the money we earn can go a little bit further down the ladder of life. All of this works. But then I look at the foreign stuff. I look at the Hamas, the Hezbollah, the IRA, and now Russia. And I don't want him in charge. It's coming up to 10:30. Do I want Theresa May in charge? Hell no. So what do I do? What do you do if you're feeling politically homeless? How has the centre ground now become people who don't trust Vladimir Putin? To the left of me, you've got your Seamus Milnites saying, oh, I think you'll find them more trustworthy than the British security services. To the right of me, you've got your UKIP loons saying this is all a plot to undermine Brexit. The centre ground now, pretty much, to my mind, just means vaguely sane, where we continue to unravel, I don't know, the national response to an apparent attack on our soil by an enemy state. That is the conclusion of our government. That is the conclusion of our Prime Minister on the advice of both her security services and her scientific advisors. But it's one rejected, at least in part, by Jeremy Corbyn's chief spokesman, a journalist called Seamus Milne, who's cast doubt upon the reliability of our security services, presumably because of the so-called sexing up of that so-called dodgy dossier in the rush to war against Iraq. And that parallel, although at the surface level it's very seductive, it doesn't make sense. Unless you're desperate, unless you've arrived at the position that you need to defend Jeremy Corbyn or his chief spokesman, and then you start moving backwards from there for reasons to defend it. Because if you were going solely on the evidence, the idea that there is any meaningful parallel at all to be drawn between intelligence from what was a hostile state effectively on the other side of the world, a distant country. Ben Nimmo, a security analyst I follow on Twitter, puts it best. Intelligence from a distant country under a hostile regime compared to claims based on events and investigations in our own country. That's why I'm asking what you think Theresa May would be up to if she was making this up or exaggerating it. And those are your three-party positions now. I'm increasingly persuaded of it. Seamus Milne, who doesn't trust our intelligence services. Jeremy Corbyn, who I think is probably more sinned against than sinning on this occasion, who wants more proof to be made public, a position actually endorsed by President Macron in France. And then the third position this morning seems to be the Shadow Defence Secretary's insistence that they're full square behind the government. We're still trying to get Nia Griffith on the phone. 10:38 is the time. I'll remind you of the number when I have a phone line free. Kathy is in Abingdon. Kathy, what would you like to say?
Hello, don't be scary, James. I'm just an ordinary common sense mum here.
Common sense.
I believe it's to derail Brexit. I'm the conspiracy theorist here, and I think that basically it's to make us look isolated and vulnerable against Russia.
We are isolated.
Stay in the EU.
Okay, and who's
they need
pulled
to give Putin that sample. They need to give him. They've got every right to that sample to see what it is. I don't believe the Novichoks come from them. And I don't see what Putin had to gain. Why would he do it before the World Cup? Why would he do it before the elections? It does not make any sense.
Okay.
And there are bigger things
I can answer all those questions if you want.
Well, I know I've heard a lot of what you said, and some bits I agree. I hate Corbyn, but it's the first time in my life I actually like what he said. I absolutely detest the man.
Right.
He's a communist and a communist sympathiser. But I liked what he said, and it was accurate to what our government should have done. They've gone in with great big boots.
Can I ask you a question?
Bigger things at stake in the EU that people are out there. A lot of people know this, but we're not
Kathy,
talking about
I think you're crackers, but we're not going to fall out.
I know.
All right.
That's what happens, you see, down here.
What I'd like you to tell me is your sort of top three sources for news, if you don't mind.
All sorts of things.
Yeah, that's why I said the top three.
Well, who are my heroes?
No, where do you get your information from?
So
you're the top three.
Through a political party that I'm in, through
what political party is that?
People, and nearly 60 years of human nature.
Yeah, and Kathy, as I said, we're not going to fall out. So what political party is it?
Why do I need to say that?
Well, because you're a common sense mum.
You're just trying to put me in a box, and I'm not in a box. I'm neither Conservative nor Labour. Not that they are Conservative.
But you told me that you hate Jeremy Corbyn, but you won't tell me who you like.
Well, he doesn't represent. I don't represent.
That's a bit odd, Kathy. That's a bit odd.
Jeremy Corbyn do not represent the real people.
So you'll tell me who you don't like, but you won't tell me who you do like. I think everybody knows what political party you're referring to.
There's not political parties out there. I'm just a people.
There's no shame in it. And the second one after UKIP, it was YouTube, was it?
Well, if you're saying UKIP I was a Brexiteer and I voted for UKIP, yes.
Yeah. So, and what was the third one? 60 years of common sense.
Yeah, 60 years of common sense, looking at people, working with people.
So
all
UKIP, YouTube, and 60 years of common sense have led you to the conclusion.
No, I'm just a people listener. I listen to people. I watch people. Yeah. You don't have to be an intellect. You don't have to diss me because I haven't got a university degree.
How do I know you haven't got a university degree? Why bring that into it?
I know you're an intellect, and I know you've travelled, and I know you're a...
Kathy, why are you making these sound like bad things?
No, I'm telling you now, the EU
what you're telling me
enemy of this country.
What you're telling me is that your opinion, which is based on UKIP and YouTube, is worth at least as much as...
I listen to other people.
For example?
All sorts of people.
Well, just give me some examples.
In my life.
Go on.
Okay, so anybody who speaks up, say, to tell you about the tyranny they've escaped and what that tyranny is about, do you think that they lie? Do you think
Kathy,
Telford are lies?
I don't know why. What are you talking about now?
We have to talk the truth. Because you're asking me where I get my beliefs, as though my beliefs.
So the idea that the government has essentially endangered the life of a police officer in order to stop Brexit. I was just interested in whether or not you'd work that out for yourself, or whether or not
you'd... whoever did it was careless.
Whether or not
unfortunately, our great police...
Kathy, I need to get a word in edgeways at some point, Kathy. I think so. Again, I just say, did you just...
Conversations. You said some great things, but you're still not hitting the nail on the head.
No, well, I can't compete with UKIP and YouTube because the depth of knowledge and investigation undertaken by...
I'm not with UKIP anymore.
Right. So what political party do you get all your news from then? All right, Kathy.
Why don't we just start listening to people who are telling the truth?
Because you have to ask, don't you? If someone claims that they're telling you the truth, you have to ask what the source is, don't you, Kathy?
How about with that?
What?
I don't believe it, and I'm not alone in believing that.
Well, that we can agree on. You are definitely not alone, but you are, I'm afraid, quite crackers. Roy's in Bristol. Roy, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'm very sympathetic to the view you put forward that nowadays people adopt sides. And it's a shame people can't approach it a little bit more calmly. So let me say where I'm at, and I agree with a lot of what you said. One, I don't distrust the intelligence services of this. Two, I'm sure the government honestly believes Russia's behind it. Three, Putin and Russia are, as you describe, dreadful. Putin is a dictator, he's an authoritarian, he's manipulative, he's dishonest, and it's a kleptocracy. So all those things are true. Now, yesterday, I was really thinking this through. I was listening to what May had to say, what Jeremy Corbyn had to say, and I found myself during the day feeling quite split, because on the one hand, I'm quite convinced Russia is behind it, but on the other hand, I was thinking we need a cool head. We need to be very careful. Russia, if it's behind it, which I'm sure it is playing a game.
Yes.
And what is crucial is that Putin's got an election on Sunday.
That's right.
I read a very interesting article in The Guardian yesterday on this, that perhaps the reason why it's being done now, and done rather shoddily, is to kick up a huge diplomatic row.
Yes.
Then Putin can turn around...
Can tear his shirt off and beat his chest in public. I mean, these are the...
And he wants to pump up the number of people voting. I mean, he'll win, but he wants to pump up the number of people voting. So I think the canny position for us to adopt is to go about it very, very carefully. Don't try and make a political point. I'm being very tough, as I think May is doing. I understand the emotion, but she's our Prime Minister. Let's go about things carefully. What we should be doing is, yes, making sure there is the evidence, and then we can get a multilateral agreement how to deal with Russia. We don't need to do it today or tomorrow.
You would be...
take time.
I hear you. The thing was, though, I think, did she not box herself into a corner with the deadline?
Yes, I think she did, and I thought that was really stupid.
I love you, Roy.
I beg your pardon?
I said I love you, Roy.
Oh, that's very sweet of you.
But seriously, because bless her little cotton socks, and obviously we have to overlook the fact that you and Cathy have the same number of votes in our democracy. You just make me feel a bit looked after. I mean, you've just been thoughtful, calm. You've not picked a side. Some of what Corbyn said makes sense. Some of what Theresa May has done is understandable. Exactly. You could probably find a nice thing to say about Vince Cable if we kept you on the line for long enough, couldn't you, Roy?
Probably true.
Yeah, you see, this is my Britain.
Side-taking, I can't stand.
No.
You talked about a loss, and I'm so with you on it.
And I think I'm probably a little bit further on the dial than you are, but that's because I'm even more persuaded of Russia's corruption than perhaps you are. But you're right. When Macron came out, when Macron's person came out yesterday and essentially said, see, even it gets written up in the Times as France defies May over Russia. Yeah. But he did essentially say that it would be helpful to see the evidence before trying to form some sort of international consensus.
Very carefully. Don't do knee-jerk responses. Chuck out diplomats right now. A lot more will be coming back here.
But what if she has got the compelling evidence? I mean, what...
I'm not sure they can possibly have evidence that shows exactly who was behind it. I'm sure they can trace where it's come from. But could they? I mean, I think it's a great investigation. I'm not criticising it, but I would have thought at this stage there will be a little gap, and that gap could be crucial, connecting the nerve agent and where it was manufactured and the Kremlin or the Russian state, the Russian kleptocracy. I think that's quite hard, and at the end of the day there won't be overwhelming proof. There'll be masses of circumstantial evidence, which is perfectly okay.
Yes.
Happens in criminal courts all the time. I was a criminal lawyer.
Were you? Oh, well, that explains it. It's your forensic legal mind that I've fallen in love with, isn't it?
Probably.
Roy, you're a star, mate, and you've...
Okay, well, lovely to talk to you.
Likewise. Keep
up the good work.
Thank you. A quick pat on the back to Beth and Alex as well for putting through those two calls in direct juxtaposition to each other, because I mean, Cathy won't like it, but that, to me, that there is your polarity. Thoughtfulness, what she would denigrate as education, a legal mind, someone who's qualified as a lawyer, therefore presumably been to university, refusing to pick a side, explaining his position carefully with reference to evidence, and a cautious conclusion at the end of it, versus UKIP, YouTube, and 60 years of common sense. They're not worth the same, those two opinions. They're just not. 10:47 is the time. And I suspect Adam Poole has done us all out of a job with his analysis via Twitter. He writes, May has done the right thing, brackets bar the deadline. The deadline. See, we've all forgotten to talk about Theresa May's competence, actually. We talked about the tone of her speech. We talked about the impressive and, to my eye, statesman-like nature of her declamations in Parliament, but we've completely forgotten her track record of complete incompetence in almost every field. Whether it be I suppose if you had to provide evidence of it, you'd say she used to try and sell herself as strong and stable. Theresa May, strong and stable. So, yeah, actually, that deadline may have been a diplomatic faux pas. I thought it was right at the time. It's a good job I'm not Prime Minister. But knowing anything about Russia, what was she actually expecting them to do? Right, by midnight tonight, you will either put your hands up and admit that you've been a very naughty boy, Vladimir, or you will explain exactly how this noxious nerve agent found its way out of Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union and ended up in Salisbury. What the hell was she expecting him to do? Genuine question. Either admit to state-sanctioned murder on British soil, which you could construe as an act of war, or explain how you lost it. He was never, ever, ever, ever going to respond. This is what I mean about the dangers of picking your position and then furiously defending it, because on Monday I thought she was playing a blinder. What day is it today? Thursday? I can't quite see how any positive response. I wish I should have stopped Boris in the corridor on the way out to ask what they were genuinely expecting Vladimir Putin to do. 10:53 is the time. Imagine the conversation in the Kremlin now. Seriously, backslapping all round, vodkas for breakfast, sundry other low-level racial stereotypes for which I apologise in advance. And then they said, you know what the kicker is. I go, what? What, Vladimir? The man in charge of their foreign policy. Boris Johnson! Oh, man. Mark's in Reading. Mark, what do you want to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, Mark.
I just wanted to call to say...
I love you.
Jeremy Corbyn... Oh, thank you. Yeah.
No, not you. I don't love you. I'm quoting Stevie Wonder. Carry on.
Oh, thank you. But I do love you. But I didn't want to say that because you don't like it when people do.
Right.
So I'm calling because I think Jeremy Corbyn perhaps got the tone wrong yesterday, but what he was saying, I think, was absolutely right. And I don't think it's right because we should distrust our security services.
Which Seamus Milne categorically said. Categorically said.
Absolutely. And I don't know as much about Seamus Milne as I should, but the things you mentioned about him worry me. But
there goes any chance I've got of an interview. I can hear Theo Osherwood upstairs tearing his hair out. 2 years he's been trying to get me an interview with Jeremy Corbyn, and now they're going to ring him out and say, bloke on LBC just said to James, the things you're telling me about Seamus Milne worry me.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Now that I've left Newsnight, I can tell you a secret. Do you want to know a secret?
Yes, please.
I had an interview lined up with him on Newsnight, and when they found out I was the presenter, they pulled it.
No.
Yeah, not just here that happened.
Don't tell me that. I like Jeremy Corbyn.
I haven't told anyone else, Mark. You're the only person that knows that.
I appreciate that. Just you and me. No one else is
seriously, keep it under your hat.
Okay, I will do. Okay, but the reason I think Jeremy Corbyn was right to say that is because he knows how this is going to play out, or he at least thinks he knows how it's going to play out. And Russia are going to do what they always do because they are an awful, corrupt regime that know they can sow confusion and mistrust. So he's just saying, let's do everything we possibly can to look like we've dotted the I's and crossed the T's and been almost as un-Russian-like as we can possibly be. And showing them the evidence, of course they're going to misuse it. Of course they are. But at least we can say, look, we've shown them. What else do you want us to do?
I'm trying to trace the provenance of this idea that there's some sort of international treaty that we could argue, that it could be argued we're in contravention of. And it comes down to a tweet from the Russian embassy that appears to deliberately misrepresent the rubric of that treaty. But the central thrust of what you say is we have to be better than them.
Absolutely. And I don't think, I think you're absolutely right. There's no, as far as I know, there's no legal reason why we need to show them. But
of course there isn't.
In the court of public opinion,
we should show our allies, maybe.
Come down to exactly. That's it.
Well, in that case, crikey, Mark, this is going to go down in history, this call, because now not only have I provided you with a world exclusive into the finer detail of my alleged career, but now I'm hearing breaking news that Emmanuel Macron has had a conversation with Theresa May this morning about the progress of this investigation and has now announced that he will unveil measures against Russia in response to the poisoning of the former spy Sergei Skripal on British soil in the coming days. So what I believe the French call a volte-face has been undertaken by President Macron.
Good.
Yeah, good, because if it's there, show it to our friends, and then we get all united and give a kicking to our enemies.
Exactly, and that's what we want. And we want to give the Russians almost no chance, because they'll do it anyway.
There's one problem.
Almost no chance to say, look what nasty Britain's doing.
Yes, it has to be incontrovertible, or as close as damn it to that position. There's one problem with your analysis.
Well, of course there is.
You've overlooked the Cathy conundrum, the suggestion that Theresa May ordered this in order to stop Brexit.
Well, of course. But
how dare you laugh? You're probably one of those intellects, aren't you?
People say that, but I don't. I do a good job of pretending to be. But
we shall see. The Cathy conundrum may confound us all. 10:57 is the time. Wayne is in Tulse Hill. Wayne, what would you like to say?
Yeah, what I'd like to say really is that I agree in part of what Jeremy Corbyn said. I think that really we should be following international law. I mean, we're saying that Russia hasn't followed the law. And if
mate, I don't. You might. It's possible you know more about this than I do. But what international law do you think it is that we're not currently following?
I think it is part of international law that we supply a sample. Is it not?
No.
Well, I thought it was part of that.
No.
But it's still part of that. I think if you're following the law, that's fine.
This is a tweet from the Russian embassy. It's the 6th tweet in a thread. Of I don't know how many, which presumably deliberately misrepresents what any requirements would be under the international conventions on preventing the use of chemical weapons. And the thing is, Wayne, the last fellow was right. We have to be better than them. But you are aware that Vladimir Putin has allowed Assad in Syria to use sarin gas on his own people.
Wait a minute. You're trying to make people say something against me that ain't true, because I believe what Jeremy Corbyn has been asking for the Magnitsky Act for the longest time, and I believe that should be implemented.
Well, so do I. I am a Magnitsky laureate. But those are three completely different things. I was just reminding you that in the context of international law and chemical weapons, Vladimir Putin has effectively green-lighted President Assad's use of sarin gas against his own people. That's not whataboutery, and I'm not suggesting that two wrongs make a right, but I'm just pointing out to you that for the Russian embassy to be tweeting about what international law is with regard to the deployment of chemical weapons probably demands a healthy dose of scepticism. Actually, let's drop the probably on that. You've got a regime that is green-lighting the use of sarin gas in Syria, trying to lecture us on what international law is with regard to chemical weapons. But I set that against that other brilliant contributor. Just reminded us we have to be better than them. Thank you for your time and attention today, especially people who have phoned in to contribute. It's helpful, isn't it? I'm not going to pick on her anymore, but we had one caller in the last hour, which I suppose could be loosely typified as having picked a side without having much information or understanding of the issue, and then furiously defending that side in the face of all dissent. And then a succession of really rather brilliant callers, all of which coalesced under an umbrella that you'd loosely describe as caution. Is caution the better part of valour? Have I misremembered that figure of speech? The point being, of course, that Theresa May, I think, dropped a clanger by issuing the deadline to Russia. These are the issues that we're going to discuss in the next hour. How the hell could Theresa May have what do you think she expected to happen? So that then leaves the door open to the possibility that she knew this was going to happen. She knew that Russia were not going to respond by stating either that, yes, we're guilty, Your Honour, bang to rights, Gov, you got me, or they were going to offer up a detailed account of how this nerve agent had somehow slipped through their grasp in the breakup of the Soviet Union or subsequently. There was no earthly way that either of them... I do this for a living, and I've left this one. It's like missing a barn door with a banjo. What the hell could have happened? Yes, yeah, right, you're right, Mrs May. Ooh, crikey, she's really put the frighteners on us, Vladimir. We better cough to this one. It was us, Gov. That was never, ever, ever going to happen. So there goes point one. Point two, option two for the Russians was to account for the presence of this Russian-made nerve agent in Salisbury. They're never going to do that either. I mean, largely because they can't, because they did do it, but partly also because that would involve international embarrassment as well. The timing of this, and some of these lines from people who get all their news from UKIP and YouTube, these lines are popping up with an echo. Why would he do it so soon before the World Cup? That's the whole point. There's no fun in being the biggest bully in the classroom unless you can constantly prove that nobody's got the guts to stand up to you. Why would he do it before the World Cup? Why would he do it before the election? This is electioneering. This is him tearing off his shirt and scrunching up his plastic surgery-covered face and beating his chest to prove what a big man he is to the Russian people. This is the bear run rampant. There are no mysteries on that side of things. So then you're left with the conclusion or the suspicion that what Theresa May was actually doing this week was electioneering as well. Unless you can account to me how this could have ended any differently, that deadline now looks like politicking, which pushes Jeremy Corbyn's position, I would argue, in a positive direction. Except that there's no earthly way that President Macron has been made privy to more intelligence than the Privy Councillor, Jeremy Corbyn, and Macron this morning has fallen four square behind Theresa May, as far as I can tell, as has Nia Griffith, the Labour Defence spokesperson, the Secretary of State, the Shadow Secretary of State for Defence. So, what is Corbyn's position? 7 after 11 is the time. Dorian is in Bristol. Dorian, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I think discretion's the better part of that.
That's the one, mate. Thank you. Well, that works as well, doesn't it?
It does. My thoughts are that lefties like Corbyn, I'm a lefty, but I think a lot of lefties, they haven't realised that Russia is no longer a left-wing country.
This is fascinating, isn't it?
Right.
Yes. Well, it is.
Socially and economically.
Well, look at LGBT issues, look at immigration, look at the anti-Semitism. It's about as left-wing as Genghis Khan.
Exactly. And I think the other thing that I think there's a problem with is, for people understanding it, is the kind of Brexiteer UKIP mindset. There's a lot of people that can't handle the cognitive dissonance of accepting that there's a negative to believing that. So I think you called her earlier. I think it can't be a bad thing. There can't be. You can't even say, well, I still, as a net positive, think that Brexit's positive, but yeah, we're going to have to put up with Russia trying to bully us.
No, well, you're right. The flaw at that.
Yeah, they feel that discomfort when something like this happens, and they then want to retrospectively come up with why it's okay.
Well, it's a position held by many people, so we won't pick on any individuals, but they are all part of that constituency you describe, and I'd loosely typify it as, crikey, this makes Brexit look like a really bad idea. We look isolated and adrift in the context of national security when we most need help. Therefore, it must be fake, because I can't even admit the possibility that Brexit is a bad idea. That's what I heard.
Exactly. That's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, well, you said it brilliantly. 9 minutes after 11 is the time. Is Bill there? We're going now live to Bill Browder, the tireless campaigner, anti-Kremlin campaigner, and the architect in many ways of this Magnitsky Act, which a lot of people will have had a crash course on over the course of the last few weeks. Regular listeners to this programme, of course, have been familiar with it now for many years. Bill, briefly, your reaction first to Theresa May's statement in the House of Commons yesterday.
Well, her statement was mostly one of intent as opposed to direct action. Kicking out 23 diplomats in retaliation for a state-sponsored act of terror using chemical weapons is not a commensurate response. And so what I'm looking for now is all the things she promised to do going forward, which have to do with freezing assets, banning visas, and investigating Russian government gangsters. And that's where the real bite is going to come from. And that's where I have some grave doubts about whether the British authorities can succeed in doing that based on the conduct of the last 8 years, in which I've been trying to get them to do that in a lot of different situations connected to the murder of Sergei Magnitsky and the money laundering. And so it's really, if it ends up being that we're just kicking out 23 diplomats in response to this, Putin will be laughing.
And do you have any sympathy for Jeremy Corbyn's, it seems to be a fluid position, but we're going to loosely typify it as wanting to see more evidence?
That's just absurd. I mean, we already know. I mean, so should we wait 5 years to respond to this whole thing? That this was a weapons grade chemical weapon, which only Russia has the capacity to produce, that was unleashed on an enemy of Russia. It's, what more do we have to know here?
Well, I think that's a rhetorical question on your part. I say this with a degree of hesitancy, but it's ground that we've covered together before, so I know that you're comfortable with it. For my money, you'd be much higher up Vladimir Putin's hit list personally than Sergei Skripal. When you see a government response to this sort of attempt upon a Kremlin enemy's life, how do you feel personally in terms of your safety?
Well, I've been at a high risk for a long time. I've come up with the one thing that Putin hates more than anything, which is a threat to his money, and he wants me destroyed, dead, out of commission one way or another. And so nothing has changed in terms of the Russians' motivation to kill me. But what worries me more than anything is the British response, because if there is no British response, then Putin will be given a message that he can go get away with murder multiple times in the UK, and then surely he's going to come and try to kill me in the UK. And so I have a much higher motivation than almost anybody in the country to make sure that the government does the right thing here and creates a proper, devastating consequence to this last action.
Is there not also a danger that if you hurt him, if Magnitsky was properly adopted here, as it has been in some other countries, then he'd be even more determined to hurt you?
No, he's already the most determined to hurt me. I have no worries about that. I have no worries about that. I mean, but all that Putin understands, he's a thug. He's a mafia thug. He understands constraints, hard boundaries, and he pushes and tries to find weakness. And he has found weakness in the UK so far. And will continue to push and push and push as the weakness spreads and grows. Final question. Was Jeremy Corbyn right to refer to, I'd love to know what you think about this, to those £800,000 worth of donations? This is earlier in the week when the initial statement was made in the House and Jeremy Corbyn drew donations to the Conservative Party into the conversation. He took a lot of criticism, but it is not necessarily quite the offence that some of his enemies suggested. Well, basically, as I've testified in front of Parliament, Britain is levitating off of a sea of dirty money from Russia, and people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. I'm sure that if you start analyzing Labour Party, you're going to find out that they're also being influenced, as is UKIP and everybody else. I mean, Russian money is just completely infiltrated the British establishment, and we need to get rid of it in all areas.
Bill Browder, take care. Many thanks, as ever, for your time and information, intelligence, insights on this programme. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call if you would like to share yours. Stops you in your tracks a bit as a gob on a stick, doesn't it, when you speak to someone who's actually on the list, who Vladimir Putin actually wants to kill. And that analysis there of an agent that could only have come from one place has only ever been made in one place. Problem is, though, when you're relying on UKIP, YouTube and Common Sense for your news, you'll be seeing something already that says, I think you'll find they were making it in Kidderminster in 1973. They had a little vat of it out the back of the fish bar on Common Sense. That is what happens. This is what I've been saying to you now for years, about 2, actually. That the news is not, Putin's mission is not to make you believe things that aren't true. It's to make it impossible for you to believe anything. So you get your InfoWars and your Breitbarts and your alt-right, and yes, I know that I have to share breathing space with some of them, and I know that they're part of the problem, but until I win the lottery and can buy my own radio station, I'm going to hang on to this microphone, thank you very much. And they offer up lies and dissemination and deceit, and they offer it up in exactly the same packaging as proper journalists do. And if you're like Kathy, and you're not really immersed in the world of news, and you see something on YouTube or on a UKIP website that looks like news, smells a bit like news, maybe even tastes like news, you're going to treat it like news. And suddenly we're living in a world where the massacre of school children in America was a hoax undertaken by their parents. That's an InfoWars line. Or we're living in a world where white supremacism is slowly bled into the political mainstream, which is happening in all sorts of places. Or we're living in a world where Russia is just as bad as us, or we're just as bad as them, and there's no consensus on anything. So it's not about making you believe things that aren't true. It's about giving people like Kathy grounds to believe that her opinions are worth just as much as MI5's. It's 11:16. That's our ground today. I think the thing I'm most struck by is how silly perhaps we were. We all get caught up in it. It's the reason why we will send our sons to die in foreign lands for causes that we don't fully understand. I mean, that is patriotism at its most dangerous. So we all have it within us somewhere. Theresa May stood up, a state-sanctioned attempt upon lives, innocent lives, or at least civilian lives, in Britain, sponsored almost certainly by the Kremlin. Theresa May stands up and makes very, strong statements, and I liked it. But the more I think about it, the more I wonder what on earth she was expecting to happen. Right, Vladimir, either you cough and own up to this now, or you show us how this agent that could only have come from one very small corner of the world ended up in Salisbury. What was she expecting to happen? We should have done that. We did it the wrong way round. We did what will she do when he doesn't respond. We should have done how on earth could she have ended up thinking that he might? Answer, she didn't. She never thought he was going to offer up a meaningful response to this, which means that what we saw in the House of Commons yesterday was an already written second chapter of a story. None of us know how it ends, of course. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. 21 minutes after 11. Nick's in Helston in Cornwall, near the Eastern Eden Project. What would you like to say, Nick?
Hello, good morning. I'm not a barium expert. I've got a PhD in the chemistry of phosphorus ligands on radioactive metal as heart and brain imaging agents. Obviously, I can't identify how it got to the UK, but the original source is beyond doubt. We have the elemental analysis, the proton, carbon, and phosphorus NMR, which is the basis of MRI, so your listeners can look it up. The infrared spectra will reveal the functional groups, as will the mass spec, but it will also identify the isotopic analysis. Phosphorus has got 23 isotopes, so we can identify the original source of it, just as the De Beers gold mine can identify the mine it came from and the year it came from an invisible flake. There is no doubt about the source of it.
Obviously, your credentials and your qualifications, I'm going to take on trust. I'm quite comfortable doing so. Why, and you don't have to answer this question because it's not why you rang in, but why couldn't Theresa May say something like that in the House of Commons? Because that would presumably have quieted Jeremy Corbyn's conniptions.
Ask Theresa May.
I knew you were going to say that. Bloody scientists. So, I mean, I'm going to give you one more invitation to indulge in a little bit of speculation.
Yeah, go on.
Do you, I mean, you must find it frustrating but utterly unsurprising when civilians and laymen like me, because on a different day with a different story, I could have ended up being the one who thought he knew more than the scientists do. It really is, in your mind, absolutely stone cold certain that this stuff came from that one place.
The isotopic analysis will identify the source of the phosphorus, which is the important element. There are 23 isotopes of phosphorus. They are not equally distributed around the world in phosphorus sources. So with mass spectrometry,
yes,
you can identify exactly where it came from. Although I can't say how it got to the UK.
No.
But the original source of the phosphorus...
Well, that's all the intelligence services have claimed, isn't it? All they can say with certainty is where it came from.
Yeah, exactly.
There's two things I'd like to say to you. First of all, thank you, obviously. But also, I think I've understood almost everything you said.
Thank you.
No, thank you. It's a testament to your powers of communication. 24 minutes after 11 is the time. I mean, look, that's the point, isn't it? You listen to Nick, who I have not encountered before, but who sounded to me like the real deal, and then we can take some of the phrases and the comments that he's used and check them if we want, or we can go on YouTube and Facebook and get our facts from there. It really is that simple. And every single day I do this in the hope that you will realise you should be trusting somebody like Nick more than somebody like Kathy. 25 minutes after 11 is the time. Bill's in Exmouth. Bill, what would you like to say?
Hello, mate. How are you?
Bill.
I'd just like to say, actually, James, that I voted for Brexit, and I now consider that my vote was wrong, and I apologise for that.
You don't have to apologise. It's the people that persuaded you.
But, however, I want to believe in the establishment. I believe that the Tory party are immersed in Russian money. I was a former member of the Labour Party until last night. I want to believe in the establishment so much.
Yeah, I do, actually.
And you know what? If my government says to me that there was a rogue agent or via Russia that's put a very indecent substance in our community.
Yeah.
I want to go to war on. I want to put my red tunic on, fix my bayonet on, because they don't have that right to do this. I believe the fundamental thing, as I said to you, I was wrong over Brexit. I accept I was wrong, but
you still want to be able to. You want to be able to trust someone. A government without trust is no government at all. And unfortunately, I think trust is broken in Britain, largely as a result of what we've been covering this morning.
I believe I'm a centralist within the Labour Party.
Right.
And I don't trust Tony Blair. I think that man actually caused the war over a crusade. And he picked on innocent people that didn't deserve this. And if there was a war to actually fight a war, we needed to be bombing Saudi Arabia. But I suspect, quite frankly, that wouldn't be feasible for a duplicitous and pernicious establishment to actually do this. So they picked on someone innocent.
There's a degree of there's hypocrisy. There's that nonsense of the notion of an ethical foreign policy. You're covering too much ground for me to keep up. My brain's still spinning from the last fella in Cornwall with his isotope.
Jack, I am so sorry for voting Brexit.
No, why?
You're right.
Oh, bless you. We're not even talking about it today. But yeah, I appreciate. I've become like a father confessor, haven't I, for regretful Brexiters.
Did someone say I was wrong? And,
I absolve you. I absolve you, Bill.
I regret.
Bill.
I regret. But
Bill.
I've got some. I don't always believe the government anymore.
No, nor do I. Nor do I. But you need to, at least on a hierarchy of trust, someone has to be at the top of it. Bill, with regards to Brexit, I forgive you.
Thank you, my dear fella.
I forgive you. I forgive you, my son. Go in peace to love and serve. I don't know. Not the Corbyn. Colin's in Manchester. Colin, what would you like to say?
Well, you're asking why people don't believe what purpose they could have in not believing Mrs May. And I think it's just the cynicism of the British public when it comes to their politicians. And it goes back generations, I'm afraid. And we are very, very cynical. The other day, I was at a meeting of governors of a school up here in the north, and over coffee with a vicar, a local businessman, a doctor businessman, and an ex-policeman, and I didn't raise the issue, and every one of them said it all looks a bit fishy, this, I think it's MI6. Now, that is, I think, almost a healthy cynicism, which programmes like yours help to breed, and you shouldn't be surprised when that cynicism is attached to people telling us that this has been used or that's been used and the Russians have done it and the whatever have done it. I mean,
this is the problem, isn't it? Is that you create an environment in which absolutely nobody is trustworthy, and somebody has to be.
And the side of a bus said that we were all going to get millions of pounds, £350 million a week to the National Health Service, and guess what? We're not going to get that now. So I wonder, James, why you're surprised that people are cynical about, and I know it's very important because the poor people have been injured, and the policemen have been. I know it's very, it's tragic.
Well, I think it's about understanding for me. If you want me to make it personal, very briefly, in that I can understand why people like Bill, the last caller, and many others who get in touch with me fell for all the snake oil they were being sold, because I was so close to watching the process of it being sold. I knew these people were charlatans and liars. I knew that they were self-serving, often sort of racist, wrong-uns. And then I spoke to my clever friends who voted for Brexit, and I believed that their ideas were a little bit idealistic and that their visions were a little bit unreasonable. So I could understand it all. So I know that people believe things that aren't true. There's nothing new there. But when the Prime Minister stands up and describes an attack on our own soil in terms based upon intelligence she has received, then it's a different flavour of cynicism and scepticism altogether for me, Colin.
Well, except I remember sitting around the dinner table with my granddad, who was in the First World War, and he was very cynical about governments telling him this and that and the other.
But again, you see, I think that the national self-interest, probably more economic than anything else, explains why we go to war, or at least wars like the First World War, treaties. I can unpick it all. Do you see what I mean? I can't unpick the process. I can unpick a process that leads someone to a wrong conclusion. I said earlier that it's this warped notion of patriotism that causes us to send our sons to foreign fields to die in wars that we don't understand because someone's run a flag up a pole and blown a blast on their blinking bugle. I get that. I can see how that happens. But I can't see how somebody who is British can be told by the British Prime Minister that there's been an attack by Russians on several people living in Britain, many of whom were British citizens, and they somehow leap to, that's probably MI6. Do you see what I mean? I can't follow that process.
But I would refer you to two little tales. One was Matilda, who told such dreadful lies. And then when there was a fire, people didn't believe it. And I'm afraid somebody cried wolf.
But again, I get the process. The boy who cried, the process works. And then it doesn't work in this context. The poor woman in the last hour, clicking on her YouTube videos, looking at her far-right websites or wherever it is, she gets her information. The reason why she is cynical or suspicious of something like this is because she feeds on an almost unleavened diet of hatred, misinformation, and really the sort of stoking up race wars now. That's all it is. It's not difficult, it's not complicated, but it's not a process that makes sense unless, of course, you acknowledge the flammability of prejudice. It's 11:32. 11:37. Allow me a brief moment to suggest that conversations like this are actually quite important. Nick in Helston, the caller of the day by some distance, possessed of the sort of scientific knowledge. I've done a little bit of checking in the interim as well, the sort of scientific knowledge that mirrors precisely the intelligence information that Theresa May had received. So here's a cautious suggestion to you. And actually, I need to read you a tweet from John Nichol, who was held hostage by Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq during the Gulf War. So I always feel that his comments on matters such as this are a little bit more important, dare I say, than the rest of us. Let's get it. He says, I'm not an intellect, nor do I have a degree. But could there be another reason why Mrs May only gave that 24-hour deadline? Would it have resulted in a different outcome if it had been 48 hours or 7 days or 6 months? No. And the press would have hammered her for prevarication. So perhaps this was a get it over with and move forward tactic. Strong stuff, actually. Very strong stuff. But as one person has already replied to John, what's the next move? Then the move after that. It's getting messier faster than... and then there's some sort of military reference that I don't understand. 11:38 is the time. It's either military or incredibly rude, which is why I'm not going to read it out. The cautious suggestions at the moment are that Theresa May is in a bit of a muddle, actually, despite seeming stronger and stabler than she has in a very long time. The muddle is caused by the fact that she's dealing with an absolute monster, in the case of Vladimir Putin. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, his Politburo, his closest advisors, don't seem to recognise the monstrousness of Vladimir Putin, and I speak mostly of Seamus Milne, his chief spokesman, when I say that, but the rest of his front bench do seem to have come into line with announcements this morning that they're full square behind the Prime Minister, and that one little olive branch, or that scintilla of hope that perhaps Jeremy Corbyn's closest admirers had, that his position would be defensible, was the French suggestion that they wanted to see more evidence as well. Well, President Macron has had a phone call with Theresa May this morning and announced that they will be taking steps against Russia imminently. I'll tell you what, the Brexit shadow, which is cast over everything, I got some sympathy. Imagine if you were in a cult, okay? And it was a cult that precluded any challenge to the ideology of the cult. And the ideology of the cult in this case is European Union bad, Brexit good. And then you see something like this happen, and your intellectual brain, the bit that deals with words and thoughts, is looking at what's happening here and thinking it is absolutely insane to be cutting ourselves off in any meaningful way from our closest allies. It is clearly insane. But you're in a cult, and a cult applies and appeals to your lizard brain. So what you get with these people that I'm seeing a lot on social media, claiming that this is deliberately done by the government to stop Brexit because it makes Brexit look so bad. And the synapse that needs to connect those 2 points is what has been cut out by the cult. So the point where you go, blimey, this is really bad, makes Brexit look really stupid, that's the point where all normal people go, oh yeah, Brexit is really stupid. But if you're in the cult and you see something happening that makes the case for unions, unity, collective action, communions, absolutely irresistible. You want to stand up to a bully. Would you rather have 10 mates, 27 mates, or no mates? It's absolutely obvious that these kind of events make Brexit look stupid. And everybody who's not in the cult, even if they are sceptical of the European Union, even if they've voted to leave, but they're not in the cult, their synapses are snapping now today. They're sort of going, oh yeah, I did quite like all that stuff about fish and passports, but if we are going to be under threat from Russia, I'd quite like to be on the same team as Germany, France and the rest of them. But if you're in the cult, that synapse doesn't snap, so you look at what's happening now and you think this makes Brexit look awful, but your lizard brain says Brexit can't be awful. Come up with another explanation for why this is happening. Q. I think Theresa May arranged it all in order to stop Brexit. You're either in the cult now or you're not. There's nothing left in between on a day like today, on an issue like this. Because here's another thing as well that you might not have noticed. I only noticed this last night. We didn't vote to join anything other than a single market. It was supposed to be a trading agreement. Explain to me how trade plays into a collective response to Russia after a state-sanctioned assassination attempt on British soil. European Union, it's got political integration. Yeah, this is political integration in action. Theresa May on the phone to the French president discussing a shared response to a mutual threat. That's political integration. Do you know what else it is? If President Macron had people being picked off on the streets of Paris by Vladimir Putin's goons, and he phoned up Theresa May to ask for help, and Theresa May said, yes, we are going to help you, even though it might draw us to Vladimir Putin's attention, which at the moment we're not really suffering from. Do you know what that is? That's a surrender of some sovereignty. Right there. Pooling resources in the national interest to act collectively. Come on. Leave the cult. It's not too late. Tim's in Margate. Tim, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, mate.
I'm really struggling with Corbyn's position. Really struggling.
All right, let me help you out.
Well, the analogy for me is this, right? So a guy, whoever he may be, stabs 3 people in the street.
Yeah.
And the police find a knife, and it's not only got his fingerprints over it, it's got his address over it and his name. So they go to his house, and they find a note saying, I fancy killing loads of people in the street, and if you don't stop me, I'm going to do it again.
Yeah.
And then when you interview him, he says, no, I've done it, but prove it, and then sticks his finger up at you. And so your response clearly to that will be, yeah, I think I need a bit more evidence. And I find that quite an astonishing place to be. And rather than saying, right, let's lock things down, let's sever safe, let's stop this guy where he stands.
Are we
think about more evidence?
Sorry to talk over you. Are we doing Corbyn a disservice? Has he moved from that position since yesterday in the way that his front bench appear to represent this morning? This is the problem when your communications director is also your communication problem, isn't it? Because Seamus Milne was on the record yesterday expressing suspicion of our own security services and apparently suggesting that we could trust the Russians to analyse this stuff properly, but we can't trust Porton Down. And he also then speaks for Jeremy Corbyn. So what Nia Griffith, and I don't know why, but none of them will flipping talk to me today. What Nia Griffith then does this morning on the BBC is say, no, our position is fully behind the government. So is that Jeremy Corbyn's position or not?
It probably is after a long discussion, but the worry for me that his initial thoughts were, let's politicise this, let's talk about
the Foreign Office, 25% cuts, or anti-terror police, and that was his initial response, rather than okay, let's stand full square there and then talk about all those other things. And that's my worry. And he's made Theresa May, quite astonishingly, look both strong and stable and emotional, because she was livid yesterday.
Yeah.
In one fell swoop.
Yeah, but she's not a monster. I mean, and I like John Nichols' response to my question of what on earth she was playing at when she set down this deadline, and he just says, look, she had to get it out of the way, because they were never going to respond in the way that she invited them to. So to give them 24 hours to do it means that they can't kick the can further down the road. It escalates the emergency. What I don't get, and I don't think I will get, even if we cancelled Mystery Hour and carried on until 1 o'clock, is people who don't think this is an emergency, Tim. They're people who somehow think, leaving aside the absolute nutters who think that this is a government plan to stop Brexit, this Kremlin apologism that sees the far right and the far left unite. It's quite incredible to see.
Quite incredible. And you read it this morning. It's a black flag operation. Of course, it's Israel. That comes into.
I haven't seen that yet.
It's Mossad, clearly.
It's as reliable as the E3 bus. It'll be along in a minute, won't it?
The 5 separations, the thing is 2 separations. You've got 2 stops to get to Israel, because clearly the Labour MPs who are friends of Israel were the ones who spoke against Jeremy Corbyn, so clearly it's Israel. I mean, this is becoming absolutely ridiculous. And the worst thing is that it's dangerous and it's frightening, because people aren't saying this is a problem.
And all of these questions about that presumably are coming from the fake news sites and the Facebook pages and the YouTube videos. Why is he doing it now? Why didn't he just shoot him? It displays such epic ignorance of Putin's modus operandi. He wants his signature on it. He wants them to have long, drawn-out, miserable experiences in hospital. He wants to tear his shirt off back in Moscow and beat his chest about how strong he is. A secret assassination without a traceable culprit is of no use whatsoever to him when he's casting himself as a cross between, I don't know how he said, Joseph Stalin and Genghis Khan. It's all so obvious. That's where the frustration kicks in for me. I don't know why I'm treating you like my therapist, Tim. You've got a very sympathetic voice.
Well, thank you. I will say, I listened to your long interview with Bill that you did on another programme.
Yes.
Your podcast, and it absolutely makes sense.
It's all there.
It's absolutely all there, and I've read more past them and thinking, well, he's kind of spot on and saying the real issue is going to become, let's go for the money. Let's go for the money.
Yeah, always.
Sort them out. This absolutely makes sense what's happening. It's no great conundrum.
I think that's why perhaps I need to learn a little bit more humility and patience with people who haven't been following this story for the best part of 3 or 4 years. I hosted the Magnitsky Awards this year. Back end of last year, was it? I think, yes, or January this year, I forget. And it is astonishing. There are people in those rooms who carry polonium detectors like the rest of us carry handbags and mobile phones. They are under constant threat, and they know that a Sergei Skripal moment is just around the corner, because they remember Alexander Litvinenko and Perepelichny and various other people whose names are not in the common argot yet. But when we first met Bill Browder, Sergei Magnitsky's name was not part of the national vocabulary. And it is now.